Chapter 51. Into the Nest of Vipers Part 3. A week came and went before the day finally arrived for Bruno, Heidi, and the kids to attend the family fathering at the von Zehntner estate. They were all dressed quite formally, with Bruno himself wearing his military uniform and all the awards he had been granted thus far in his career, which wasn't much at the moment. After driving together in the family automobile, the estate's servants opened the gates to reveal that there were several other automobiles parked in the driveway. This was, after all, not just a gathering of Bruno and his siblings, but also his siblings' families, and that of his uncles, aunts, and cousins as well. There were well over 100 people gathered in the estate grounds, specifically in the back where tents had been gathered, and food was being properly catered to the guests. Those among Bruno's brothers and cousins who were actively serving in the military, of course, wore their uniforms, while those like Bruno's father who were retired, but had been awarded rather exceptional orders and medals during their time of service, wore them across their formal tuxedos. It was a gathering, in many ways, of some of the most elite members of society in the city of Berlin. After all, the von Zehntner family had risen to prominence as a result of Bruno Sr. and his role in the Bundeswehr. Powerful and wealthy noble families had begun engaging their children to the younger generation of the family, and because of this, many of them were in attendance as well. It was perhaps not at all surprising when Bruno entered the scene and was quickly greeted by the father of his cousin's daughter's fiancé, who himself was the sixth son of the third in line for some grand duchy or another. Well, if it isn't the Wolf of Prussia, General Lieutenant Bruno von Zehntner himself, the youngest general in the history of the Reich. Congratulations on your recent promotion and your victory at Mukden. I must say, I am quite the fan of yours. Would you mind if I had a moment of your time to discuss? Bruno cut the man off. He had no time to deal with sycophants and pampered nobles who wanted to leech off of the fame he had recently gained. Apologies, I'm quite busy at the moment. I have just arrived and must pay my respects to the host. If I am available at another time, then I would love to listen to whatever it is you have to say. After saying this, Bruno paid the man no attention, instead walking past him, while guiding his wife and children to pay their respects to his parents. The man who had tried to introduce himself to Bruno had a sour expression as he drank from the crystal glass, which contained wine, murmuring something two-faced or another about Bruno behind the man's back as he walked away. It was not long before Bruno met with his father, who was surrounded by his wife and 8 other children, several of which Bruno had neither seen nor heard from since their last gathering as a family during the previous year. Among their ranks were his old childhood rivals, if you could even call them that, Ludwig and Kurt, both of which were also dressed in uniforms from the army. But they were lacking both rank and distinction, as they were mere captains, having gained their ranks not through battle like Bruno had in China, but simply from time and service. The only medal they had pinned to their chests was the one given out to all service members shortly before Bruno graduated from the Officers' Academy, which was a medal issued by the Kaiser as a commemoration of his grandfather's 100th birthday, or what would have been his 100th birthday if he was still alive at the time. There was very clear evidence of jealousy and bitterness in their eyes as they gazed upon Bruno's rank and distinctions, which he had earned through combat. But the two of them did not say anything as their younger brother introduced himself properly to his father. Sorry for the late arrival, father. We had a bit of a minor incident prior to heading out, but we are here now, so I hope you won't hold me too accountable. Bruno Sr. gazed upon his son in his military uniform and was quick to compliment on his achievements on the battlefield. My son, a general at the age of 25. You have no idea how proud of you your mother and I are, Bruno. Speaking of his mother, the woman was standing by her husband. If it weren't for the fact that her hair had grayed, as she was now in her mid-50s, one would suspect she was only now turning 40. For whatever reason, she aged extremely well, and those genes had apparently carried over into her children, many of which were approaching their 40s themselves, but still looked a decade younger. The mature beauty was quick to hug her youngest son and drag him into her embrace, something which caused all of her other sons to roll their eyes. No matter how old Bruno was, their mother would still baby him as the youngest of them all. There's my baby boy. You little brat. You have been neglectful towards your mother. Bruno couldn't help but sigh as he broke away from his mother's embrace, who continued to struggle, even as he pushed her away. Mother, calm yourself. For Christ's sake, you are hosting a public event, so act with some class. The woman could only shamelessly pout as her youngest son refused to let her embarrass him any further, an act which gained a collective sigh from her husband and all 9 of her sons. Even Heidi sighed before introducing herself to her mother-in-law. "Mother, it has been too long. You are looking as lovely as ever." Elsa couldn't help but hug Heidi as well, while Bruno snickered at her. Of all of her sons' wives, Heidi was without a doubt her favorite, probably because she married her favorite son, and she was quick to make this known, despite everyone else already being aware of it. "There's my beloved daughter. You really have been keeping your distance lately, haven't you? And where are my grandkids?" All 3 of Bruno's children, even the youngest who was named after her grandmother, looked aggrieved as they received hugs and kisses from the woman, until, of course, she was pulled away by her husband, who forced her to calm down. "All right, that's enough, Elsa, we get it. You missed Bruno and his family. Now, can we please conduct ourselves with some proper civility?" Elsa couldn't help but sigh, as she recovered instantly from her overly affectionate behavior and shamelessly denied ever behaving as such. "I'm sure I don't know what you are talking about. Now that Bruno has arrived, how about you all go and enjoy yourselves? There will be much for us to discuss at dinner. In the meantime, I am sure you all are all dying to mingle with each other. It is, after all, rare for us to be together as a family like this." With this said, Bruno walked off with his family to the edge of the festivities, sitting down exhausted from this brief exchange with his mother, father, and brothers, while Heidi fetched him a beer. As for his kids, they played among themselves, seemingly isolated from the other children their age who were at the event. He planned to sit it out and wait until everything was over like he did everywhere. But unfortunately, his fame was far greater now than it was in the past, and there were several distant relatives who couldn't help but introduce themselves, some of which had shameful intentions. For example, his aunt on his mother's side approached Bruno with her teenage daughter in tow. The girl was quite like her mother, insofar that she was quite pretty, with red hair and green eyes. But Bruno took no interest in her, even as the girl's mother rambled on about how much the young girl admired him and his exploits. It was clear that the girl was anxious, nervous, and embarrassed by her mother and her shameless statements. Naturally, this was only one of many indicators that caused Bruno to understand that everything his aunt said was utter bullshit. There was only one reason the woman was acting this way. She shamefully wanted to get Bruno to either engage his son to her daughter or take the girl as his mistress, neither of which Bruno had any intention of doing. Luckily for him, Heidi returned before long with the beers, and because of this the man's aunt as well as her teenage daughter fled together like cockroaches that had been exposed to sunlight. Despite this, Heidi couldn't help but make a joke at Bruno's expense. "That girl was quite pretty. Are you sure you're not searching for a mistress? The girl's mother seemed awfully keen on selling her to you for the right price." Bruno could tell by the smirk on his wife's face that she was clearly trying to antagonize him. No doubt because she knew his personality when it came to stuff like this. And because of this, he stood up and flicked her forehead before seizing one of the beers from her hand, which Bruno took several large gulps of before finally responding to his wife's sarcastic remarks. "Oh, please. Harems are nothing more than the perverted fantasies of teenage boys. The idea of having multiple beautiful women attend to your desires might seem like something great in theory, but the reality is that it is simply exhausting to support more than one woman and her emotional needs. Besides, if I really wanted such a thing, there were more than a few beautiful and exotic women in Asia that were quite willingly throwing themselves at me. Even the royal family of Japan seemed interested in the idea. Why on earth would I do something as cliched as taking my cousin as my mistress? I might be a nobleman, but I'm not a Habsburg." After saying this, Bruno walked away from Heidi, smirking, as he knew that she was pouting at his remarks. The rest of his day would be one that was purely tiresome from his perspective. That is until the big announcement was made at the dinner feast. Chapter 52, The Family Business Part 1. Dealing with this family was an exhausting feat, especially after having just come back from the war in Manchuria no more than a week prior. In the past, however, it was more tolerable, as those at the gathering generally left him and his family alone. But Bruno's recent infamy as a fearsome general within the German army had caused all kinds of pests to flock to his side. Cousins he didn't even know he had, as well as the families of those they were engaged, tried their best to establish ties with the man. In fact, Bruno could have sworn this was the largest family gathering yet. And though his father may think that was something to be prideful about, as it meant their power and prestige were growing, Bruno found it nothing but irksome. There were simply too many here who had posed no actual benefit to the family. Leeches, sucking away at the family's fame and fortune. It was truly a troublesome matter. One, if it had been left to Bruno's hands, would have resulting a culling, so to speak. But the man managed, as best he could, at least to entertain these leeches and vultures, making no promises, but rather paying them mere lip service, as that was the most respect they deserved from him. As for Bruno's wife, she was always nearby, clinging to his side, not only to make sure that none of these little hussies could manipulate her man or blackmail Bruno into doing something he shouldn't, but also simply because Heidi found it to be her duty as a wife to share the social burdens her husband was forced to bear. Meanwhile, Eva, Erwin, and Elsa gathered with the other children, who in the past had made fun of them for their mother's questionable heritage. But now they weren't saying anything. In fact, they seemed quite timid, afraid even. Though it was nice to no longer have to listen to the brats whisper in the background, it was almost equally as irritating for them to behave like the three of Bruno's children were some kind of monsters that they had to be very careful around. The three kids, of course, could not understand the lengths to which their father had gone to in order to protect them. Lengths that may have caused these spoiled little noble children to become fearful. Either way, Bruno could only keep an eye on his kids for so often. Eventually, after drinking 6 beers in the span of 2 hours and smoking an entire pack of cigarettes, Bruno found an opportunity to escape from the leeches and vultures of the party which had flocked to his side. And that came in the form of his eldest brother Franz. The man approached Bruno as several women of varying ages tried to get in the young general's good graces. No doubt the man intervened because of the fact that Heidi looked like she was about to snap. To say that she had stabbing vibes was an understatement. Perhaps it was because of this that Franz put on a polite F.A. Ade as he asked the women to allow him some proper time alone with his brother. "Pardon me, ladies. I do not wish to interrupt the fun you seem to be having with my youngest brother, but the Generalleutnant and I need to have a word alone. It's a family matter, you see." The women naturally did not stand on ceremony and thanked Franz for his kindness as they walked away, leaving Bruno and Heidi alone with Franz, who, once he was sure nobody was listening, reached into his coat pocket and grabbed a pack of cigarettes, offering one to Bruno as he expressed his true thoughts aloud. "Fucking harlots, trying to con a married man into sleeping with them, and in front of the man's wife no less. Utterly disgraceful. I see you have had your own troubles, little brother. Since you appear to be out of cigarettes, would you like one of mine?" Bruno did not even respond as he grabbed a cigarette from the pack his brother was holding out in front of him and lit it aflame before taking a long drag. Once he exhaled a large plume of smoke to the wayside, he was quick to ask his oldest brother bluntly what was so important that he would go out of his way to help his youngest brother. "And to what do I owe the pleasure? If you think I'm indebted to you because of this matter, I will assure you I was handling things just fine without your interference." Franz chuckled and shook his head before voicing his thoughts on his youngest brother and the man's arrogant attitude. "Paranoid until the bitter end, aren't you? Believe it or not, Bruno, we're not all out to get you. I mean, don't get me wrong, those little shits Julian and Kurt. I'm sure they have something planned for later this evening to humiliate you and your family. But I don't care about the petty jealousy of those fools. No, I'm far more interested in the little genius of the family. I get the feeling that you have other designs in mind that you are hiding away, no doubt for the future. Am I right? How about I buy them from you? And I don't mean the pittance I paid you for the previous ones. What do you say? Pittance." Did this man realize what he was saying? The money which his brother had paid him years ago was by no means a small fortune. Just how wealthy was the von Zehntner family to consider such a vast sum of pittance? If the current exchange was roughly 4 German marks for every US dollar, then Bruno had received over 2.8 million German marks for the designs he gave his family. Sure, when these weapons finally entered service and were produced in the millions for use in the German army, they would no doubt generate a significantly larger sum for the von Zehntner family. But even so, if adjusted for inflation, then the fortune his brother had given him would have been the equivalent of over $25 million in 2024. And Bruno had already invested a significant amount of this money into domestic and foreign industries. Whether it was those German, Swiss, and Austrian corporations that would one day become known across the world, or those from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, etc. Bruno had invested a large portion of his money into the global market, and in doing so secured the wealth of his family for the decades to come. Despite this, Bruno reserved a significant amount of the money his brother had given him for his own personal ventures. After all, there were many designs that Bruno had in mind which his family's current arms factories were simply incapable of producing. They were, after all, designed with producing small arms and artillery in mind. But machines of war? Well, that was a future industry that had not yet become a reality outside of naval warfare. And it was a much more profitable industry at that. For example, Bruno began acquiring factories, tooling, engineers, machinists, etc. together for the purpose of building his own military-industrial corporation. While there was no doubt that his oldest brother Franz would be inheriting the vast majority, if not all, the von Zehntner family's wealth and industry upon the death of their father, the reality was that Bruno had only given his brother designs that were suitable for their family's current factories. No doubt these would be important weapons for the coming war, and would generate an immense profit over the coming decades. But there were still 3 areas of industry for the German war machine that the corporation known as Waffenwerk von Zehntner were not involved with. One of those industries had yet to be even developed, as the invention of the airplane was still a relatively recent phenomenon. Bruno intended to begin the production of aircraft for military use in the coming years. But it was not just military aircraft that Bruno intended to begin the production of. Rather, he also intended to have factories for the manufacture of armored vehicles as well. In addition to this, he had begun acquiring land to construct a naval shipyard at. In essence, Bruno intended to leave his extended family with the production of things like rifles, machine guns, pistols, grenades, mortars, rocket launchers, and artillery, while he took over the heavy industry of making aircraft, armored vehicles, and ships. That was, after all, where the real money was at when it came to the military-industrial complex. After all, the price per tank was significantly higher than that of the price per artillery piece, let alone when one began comparing aircraft and naval vessels. And it was with all of this in mind that Bruno simply smirked at his brother and flicked his cigarette to the ground, which he stomped out after finishing it. His words were quite smug as he informed his brother that he indeed had plenty of designs in mind, but they were for his own use only. Oh, dearest brother, you are correct to assume that I have so much more in this head of mine, but I have plans of my own for the future. After all, it wouldn't be fair if I simply gave you all of my fortune-generating ideas for, as you describe, a mere pittance. Though I must thank you. The compensation you gave me for my previous blueprints has indeed gone a long way towards making me and my family very wealthy for generations to come. Still, there are some things I have planned for the near future that you might be able to help me with. I'll send them over to you when I am done with them. As for the price, that can be negotiated upon when I am finished with the initial drafts. Now come along, Heidi. There are still many family members I have yet to speak with, and time waits for no man. After saying this, Bruno walked off, leaving Franz to sigh and shake his head. He had tried, but in the end, Bruno had his own plans. It was a pity. He was even willing to go so far as to give the boy part ownership of the family company after their father died. Still, he couldn't help but wonder to what heights this genius little brother of his would rise to in the coming years. And because of that, Franz wasn't the least bit mad at Bruno. Chapter 53, The Family Business Part 2. Hours passed, and by the time the evening arrived, the grand banquet had begun. As a member of the main branch of the von Zehntner family, Bruno was naturally seated at what one could call the primary attraction, which was a large table in the center of the venue meant for Bruno, his 8 brothers, their wives, and his parents. As for the children, they were off at various tables meant for the younger generations of the main family. In addition to this, there were side tables set up throughout the area where the branch families and other vaunted guests were sitting. Servants would run throughout the venue, providing various food trays, as well as refilling the drinks of the guests. It was a feast of epic proportions, one which Bruno was all too familiar with considering he grew up in a noble household. And as Bruno silently ate his food, while his wife Heidi mingled with his family on his behalf, his father gathered everyone's attention by clinging his fork to a glass. Immediately, Any conversation that was being had in the room went silent, as all eyes gathered towards the table where the main family sat. Its patriarch stood up and began to announce the reason why he had gathered everyone here, or at least why the date had been moved up so early. I would like to thank those of you who could make it today, and extend my best wishes to those members of our family and our friends who were invited but otherwise could not attend today's gathering. As always, we gather together as a family once per year, where we chat among ourselves and build connections that otherwise would not occur without our little reunions. And every year I make a little toast to you all and all that you have accomplished. But today, I want to be a little selfish and make a toast to a member of my own immediate family, rather than all of you. Over the years, my various sons have gone on to accomplish great things. Some are naturally more than others. However, there is one of my children who has performed so admirably that not only has the Kaiser set his eyes upon him, but so has a foreign monarch, who I have recently been extended an invitation to visit his realm as a show of thanks towards the effort of my son in question. For those who aren't aware, my youngest son Bruno has recently been promoted to the rank of General Lieutenant, a rank which will entail far greater responsibilities with his job at the German Army's High Command. He has also been awarded a great honor by Emperor Meiji of Japan. No doubt many of you have seen the foreign medal pinned to my son's chest. Well, I assure you that this is an award which the Empire of Japan grants to soldiers for their valor in the field. It is for this reason which I have moved up the date of this gathering, as my son will be forced to return to his duties sometime next week. And considering he has just returned from the war in Manchuria, as well as having just been promoted by the Kaiser, I felt we should all take a moment to honor this esteemed member of our family, who has in his short military career climbed to greater heights than any of our ancestors. Congratulations, my son, on your victory. Bruno was forced to stand and bask in the praise given to him by his extended family. His father's words were quite excessive, but there were no lies within them. Bruno had helped the Japanese achieve a great victory at Mukden, but it was a victory they would have won regardless of his interference in the matter. All he had really done was speed up an end to the Russo-Japanese War, something that would have massive consequences on the timeline, consequences that Bruno could not easily predict. Because of this, he remained quite humble as he stood up and assured everyone that he had done nothing spectacular. Though your praise is welcome, I fear it is a bit too much. I only did my duty as requested by the Kaiser and his general staff. Regardless of my contributions, it was inevitable that the Empire of Japan would win their war with the Russians. After saying this, Bruno sat down and drank from the liter of beer he had been served with dinner. Though he had told the truth, his family did not believe them. Rather, they saw his remarks as an act of humility. I mean, how could the Japanese ever defeat the Russians without the support which the Reich had given them? And that was most definitely the view that many Europeans had on the Russo-Japanese War. Victory at Port Arthur and Mukden did not belong to the Japanese, but rather to the German Reich and the general they had sent to aid the minor empire. It was definitely a matter that created complex feelings for the Empire of Japan. Although on the one hand, they were thankful to the material aid which their allies in the German Reich provided to them, as well as the contributions which their military advisors had made in the war effort. There were indeed those among the Japanese royal family, as well as the empire's military leadership, that felt their pride had been wounded by these things. Needless to say, relations between the Empire of Japan and the German Reich were contingent upon the relationship between Kaiser Wilhelm II and Emperor Meiji. But what would happen when Meiji died in 1912? Even Bruno was not sure if the Japanese emperor's successor would honor his father's wishes, or instead hold personal animosity towards the German Reich for taking the credit at Port Arthur and Mukden. Regardless of these future developments, Bruno's stock within his family and the German Reich in general was at an all-time high. And because of this, the rest of the family gathering was spent in his honor. Bruno would eventually return to his own personal home with his family later that night, with his wife and children, all of which were thoroughly exhausted by the events of the day. Heidi would quickly help the children get to bed before asking Bruno if he planned to do the same. "Are you coming to bed, dear?" Despite himself being quite tired by today's events, Bruno had other plans. At least for the next 2 hours, he would get to work on the first of his next plans for the German war machine. Because of this, he shook his head before responding to Heidi's question. I have a few work matters to attend to. I'll be up for another 2 hours at the latest. You can go to sleep before me." Heidi pouted, but did not make a move to stop Bruno from getting some work done. She did not know what was so important that he had to stay up until midnight. But if Bruno didn't want to tell her about it, then she did not need to know. Because of this, she climbed into bed, while Bruno got started on designing the engine that would make German air supremacy something that would last for the entire duration of the Great War that was to come. The powertrain used for this mechanical bird which would rule the skies had been known as the BMW 6. It was a water-cooled V12 engine built during the interwar period of Bruno's past life. And while it was by no means something that could be used competitively in the Second World War that would follow, for the Great War, it was well beyond anything that would be fielded by his enemies. In addition to this, Bruno came up with an aircraft machine gun for use in his future warplanes. While the MG-34 was considered a universal machine gun, insofar as it could fulfill most military applications. 8mm machine guns that were equipped as the primary weapons of interwar-era aircraft required a more unique solution. Unlike the engine and the aircraft which it would be built around, Bruno did not intend to manufacture these machine guns, which were based on the MG-17 himself, and instead would gift his older brother Franz with the designs, as small arms were more of what Waffenwerk von Zehntner specialized in. That wasn't Bruno's only reason for sending these designs to his brother and the arms corporation which he ran. After all, Waffenwerk von Zehntner owned many of the patents involved with making the MG-34, and many of the principles used in the MG-17 aircraft machine gun had been taken from the MG-30 and MG-15 designs from Bruno's past life, which themselves were partially carried over in the creation of the MG-34. Because Bruno had given the rights of the MG-34 to his family's arms corporation, they had the patents for several of the designs used within the MG-17, thus simply making it easier for him to contract the guns used in his future aircraft designs from his brother. Still, Bruno did not come close to completing either design with the 2 hours he had given himself on this night, and instead climbed not to bed after the time was up like he had promised. He would spend the next week making these 2 blueprints. As for when they could enter production, only time would tell. Chapter 54. The Might of German Steel. It took a few days' worth of effort, but in the end the MG-17 and the BMW 6 blueprints were completed, or at the very least, the initial draft of them was done. Again, with all of Bruno's designs they would need to undergo extensive modifications and testing in order to be fit for service. But at the very least, they could build a functional prototype for both off of these devices. The reality was that not a single nation had established an air force yet. In fact, the idea of using aircraft for military applications was still several years away. And it was because of this that Bruno wanted to keep the creation of the German Luftstreicher, FTE, a secret from the rest of the world for now. After all, the first use of military aviation in Bruno's past life came in 1909 when the U.S. Army purchased a Wright Model A for use in its Signal Corps. But that was still several years away. If the other great powers realized that the Germans had begun construction of aircraft for military purposes, then it would no doubt result in a major arms race. Because of this, Bruno wanted to begin development and testing in secret, and he had purchased quite a decent plot of land for this purpose. Not only was his aviation manufacturing plant established on this land, but so was a small airfield which could be used to test the equipment. This was in addition to the secondary plot of land that Bruno established a manufacturing plant on for the sake of producing armored vehicles. He had acted swiftly upon gaining the funds to do so from his brother as a reward for giving his family's arms corporation the designs for the next generation of small arms and artillery. With this money secured, Bruno bought up the land that was ideal for this purpose and began the construction of these manufacturing plants and testing grounds. By now, after several years had passed, the plants were fully operational, and the staff were employed, trained, and ready to begin working on the secretive projects. All that was needed was for Bruno to give them the initial drafts of the weapons they intended to perfect and produce. The first thing that Bruno wanted to produce was an aircraft that fulfilled 4 distinctive roles in the military. The plane in question could function as either a reconnaissance aircraft or a dedicated fighter. It could operate as a ground support craft with the use of bombs, or it could be used as a float plane for naval operations. What role it carried out depended on the variant which was manufactured. While there were better interwar designs to choose from, Bruno had opted for the versatility of the He-51 platform. It was after all an interwar design, with a superior engine, fire control systems that were integrated into the cockpit of the pilot, and was made out of aluminum rather than wood and canvas like the vast majority, if not all, the Great War-era fighters had been. Sure, it wasn't the best option if Bruno was preparing for the Second World War. But the year was 1904. If he was preparing for the Great War, then this was an excellent plane for the job, and it could be outfitted for multiple roles. It was because of this that Bruno was so hellbent on this aircraft. Naturally, it would be ideal if he could create a dedicated strategic bomber as well. But frankly, he first needed to prove to the world that aluminum-framed aircraft were indeed capable of flight. After all, he was basically advancing the world of aviation by 20 to 30 years with the introduction of the He-51. And if Bruno wanted to secure support from the German army for the further development of such weapons, then he would need to prove that his theories were indeed correct in the first place. Aside from the He-51, Bruno also began the production of the world's first tank. Tanks were weapons that were introduced at the end of the Great War. While the Entente had fielded thousands of such weapons by the time the armistice was declared, the Germans had managed to manufacture a grand total of 20 tanks for the war effort. They instead relied on anti-tank warfare with the use of their Mauser tank-aware M1918, which proved quite effective in the field, with the German army reportedly taking out a significant chunk of the Entente's tank corps by the time the war came to an end. But in this life, Bruno would be the first to introduce the tank. After all, Great War-era tanks could be equated to armored tractors. They were large, poorly designed, cumbersome devices that often got stuck in the mud of the trenches and could even be disabled with something as simple as grenades being stuck to the tracks as they plowed over a trench. In addition to this, they were made from riveted armor, often in shapes that had no chance of deflecting oncoming rounds, making it incredibly easy for a scaled-up Mauser like the tank-aware M1918, which was chambered in the hefty 13.2 mm tough cartridge, to penetrate through and kill the crew inside. Hell, the M2 Browning and its .50 BMG cartridge was designed at the end of the war specifically to deal with tanks, only for them to be rapidly improved upon to the point where it could no longer fulfill its intended purpose. But Bruno knew how tanks would develop in the future, and intended to make what was effectively the best and most cost-effective tank design that could be fielded prior to things like the invention of composite armor and imaging devices, which became standard almost immediately after WW2, both of which required advanced materials which the world did not currently possess the ability to manufacture. For the purposes of the Great War, a medium tank like the Panzer V Panther was simply overkill. No, what Bruno wanted to produce was a tank that existed entirely on paper during his past life, having been a post-war modification of a Second World War German prototype. In 1945, with the war coming to an end, the German army decided for whatever reason to spend a significant amount of resources developing tanks to replace their entire lineup. Everything from light tanks used in Renaissance to super heavy tanks which were impossible to field in any practical sense. These prototype designs, if you can even call them that, as they only existed on paper, were known as the Entwicklung series, or the E-series for short. The smallest of which was the E-10, which was designed to weigh between 10 to 25 tons. The actual E-10 was designed to replace the Jagdpanzer 38 tank destroyer. However, post-war enthusiasts came up with a variant of the tank, which made use of the 1942 prototype VK 16.02 Leopard light tanks turret, which contained a 5 cm main gun along with a coaxially mounted 7.92 mm MG-34 machine gun. What were the advantages of such a tank? Well, aside from its torsion bar suspension, which made it easy to produce, and from cheap materials, unlike previous designs which required more rare metals which the Reich did not possess in significant quantity. It was also designed on a proven, reliable, and easy-to-maintain 80-centimeter overlapping steel-rimmed wheels for their suspension, taken from the Tiger series of tanks. Not only that, but the E-series tanks made use of thicker slanted armor, which for Bruno's designs were made out of cold-rolled homogeneous armor. This was an armor system significantly stronger than the riveted steel plates that Great War designs, and many later interwar designs made use of. This type of armor was only second to modern composite armor, which Bruno did not have the means to make. Because of this, these tanks would be virtually indestructible on a Great War battlefield. The only thing his enemies would really be capable of using to destroy one would be a direct hit from an artillery piece. Not only that, but the 5 cm gun, while light by Second World War standards, was more than enough to punch through Entente armor and defensive fortifications. On top of all of these benefits, the most beautiful thing about these tanks is that no matter how large he scaled them up in size, they could be made on the same assembly line, with the same production methods. Meaning that even in next few decades, when Bruno was eventually preparing for the possibility of a Second World War, the medium, heavy, and super heavy tanks of the higher weight classes, as well as any variation which the chassis was used for, such as armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, and flak panzers, were all built with the same production line, allowing for peak modularity and efficiency in their construction. To put it simply, with this single tank design, Bruno had ensured the German army was not only equipped with significant advantages in the Great War that was to come, but also for the Second World War that had the potential to follow, even if the German Reich emerged victorious in the next decade. Either way, Bruno looked forward to seeing these weapons used on the battlefield, and how quickly they could allow for a German victory. Ultimately, a blitzkrieg was still not possible in 1914, not unless the entire means of German military transportation and logistics was mechanized by them, which, even if Bruno was a reincarnate, achieving this was simply not possible in the time frame he had been given. It was because of this that Bruno intended in the coming years to convince the German High Command to adopt a defensive strategy, preparing for the war with extensive fortifications around the German Reich to bleed the enemy dry, while preparing as much armor as possible for the eventual day when the offensive would finally be taken. Only then would he reveal these machines of war, and how devastating they would prove to be against the bitter, battered, and exhausted Entente forces. How quickly would Paris fall under the might of German steel when the day finally arrived? It was a question that Bruno was personally excited to see the answer to. Chapter 55. The Russian Revolution continues. As Bruno was entertaining his family at their yearly gathering and spending the next week designing machines that would usher in a new era of warfare, Russia was in chaos. The initial rioting undertaken by Marxists after the failures of the Russian army in Manchuria, as well as the massacre of violent protesters by imperial troops, had turned into a full-scale revolution. Armories were looted by the Marxist rebels, the so-called Red Army, while the Tsar tried his best to maintain peace and order through the use of absolute force. Funny thing about using force to suppress the people when they were venting their grievances through violence. It oftentimes had the opposite effect as intended. For every Marxist killed in the revolution, the papers, or at least those that were printing underground after the Tsar began to suppress the press for inciting revolution, spun tales of peaceful protesters being bayoneted in the streets by Tsarist loyalists, known as the Black Hundreds. This sparked outrage not only in the motherland, but abroad, as well as foreign interests such as private corporations with sympathies towards Marxism began to funnel in cash flow to the rebels so they could secure more arms from the international black market. There were also several other wealthy individuals who, for reasons other than being communists, supported the Bolshevik Revolution, such as being anti-monarchist, pro-democracy, or outright just hating the Tsar for personal reasons. Blood flowed through the streets as the Black Hundreds, alongside forces of the Tsar, stood off against the various revolutionary groups, all of which had some ties to Marxist philosophy. The cruelty which these loyalist militias engaged in when it came to suppressing suspected Marxists only further brought sympathy to the communists by the common man. And because of this, the moment that Bruno returned to his post at the Central Division of the German Army's High Command, he found that the Kaiser was standing in the main office, conversing with his field marshals. Men such as the Chief of Staff Alfred von Schlieffen and the infamous Field Marshal August von Mackensen voiced their opinions on the Russian Revolution, both of which were at odds on how to handle the matter. Alfred von Schlieffen saw this as an opportunity to weaken the Tsar and the Russian armed forces. By now, it was starting to appear that a major war would break out between the great powers sooner or later. This fear had been in the minds of German strategists ever since the Franco-Russian alliance was formed in 1894. But it would not be until a year later where the Schlieffen Plan was formed to counter this. The Schlieffen Plan, of course, resulting in abject failure during Bruno's past life at the Second Battle of the Marne, which resulted in years of brutal trench warfare on the Western Front. Fundamentally, the Schlieffen Plan was created to knock France out of the war early by marching German troops through Belgium, so the focus of the German military could be centered on a single front with Russia. This obviously did not go as planned, instead provoking the UK to join the war, only further adding to the death, despair, and chaos of the Western Front, something that would eventually lead to the defeat of the Central Powers in 1918. Naturally, because of the Schlieffen Plan's failures and the disastrous results that followed, it was Bruno's intent to undermine it entirely so that the German army did not make such mistakes in this life. Speaking of mistakes made by the German Reich, in 1917, as the Second Russian Revolution broke out, the Kaiser opted to supply the Bolsheviks with arms. The reason for this was not ideological sympathies, but rather naivety. The Kaiser had assumed that the Bolsheviks would fail to topple the Tsar and the Romanov dynasty, but at the very least, they would cause problems for the Russian army, which the German army could capitalize on to end the conflict in the Eastern Theater. The indirect result of which was the formation of the Soviet Union, something which had disastrous consequences for the entire world during Bruno's past life. And currently, Schlieffen was expressing a similar intent. Quite frankly, Your Majesty, I do not agree with General Feldmarschall von Mackensen and his perspective. This ragtag group of rebels has no chance of defeating the Russian army and the loyalist militias that have formed in support of them. All we will be doing by giving them military aid is ensuring that the Russian army is in worse shape when the war with France finally arrives. Having just entered the room to witness the discussion between the Kaiser and multiple German generals, Bruno felt the need to voice his input on this matter as he announced his presence by doing so. Oh, on the contrary, I fear you underestimate the will of the people. The hatred that the Russians have for the Tsar isn't some matter that can easily be resolved. If you give the Bolsheviks weapons and munitions to fight against their masters, then you will only be igniting a powder keg, one that I fear would create a fearsome enemy not just for the German Reich, but for all of humanity. The generals all looked at Bruno, who had entered the scene. Though Bruno immediately countered the chief of staff's position, the man was not as angry with him as he would have been in the past. After all, he no longer saw Bruno as a man unbefitting of his position. Rather, Alfred von Schlieffen now was in agreement with the Kaiser insofar that Bruno was an exceptional talent, one who may one day take over his position when he eventually retired. And because of this, he listened to the young general's position on the matter at hand, quickly asking for him to elaborate further on what he knew of the matter. An interesting perspective. But I do find it hard to believe that these rebels would defeat the Tsar and his army. How can you be so certain of your claims? Bruno scoffed as he walked over to the war table, which represented the various factions in play during the ongoing Russian Revolution. He was quick to make a bold statement that caused all the generals to look at Bruno in awe. Why wouldn't I be certain of my claims? This is, after all, my doing. Had I not been so ruthless in the pursuit of crushing the Russian army at Mukden down to the last man, then by all means this revolution would be far more tame. After all, it was inevitable that the Japanese would emerge victorious in their war with Russia, but not so soon, and not with such an overwhelming display of power. The loss which the Russians have sustained at my hand has been humiliating in ways that perhaps only the French can understand. It has also been a display of Russian incompetency, or more specifically, that of its leadership. This has sparked a far greater resentment among the Russian people for their monarch and the nobles beneath him. If we do not restore the people's faith in the Tsar, then they will flock to the Bolsheviks who oppose him. Therefore, I suggest we begin sending rifles, artillery, and munitions, as much as we can afford to aid the Tsarist forces in their attempts to put down this rebellion once and for all. Your Majesty, surely you understand that this is a valuable opportunity to repair the relations with your cousin, do you not? After all, I do not see their allies in France lifting a helping hand now that the Tsar is in need of it. The Kaiser's eyes lit up in understanding after hearing these words come from Bruno's mouth. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, but Bruno was right. After what happened in China and the following events in Manchuria, the Kaiser honestly believed any chance of returning to normal relations with the Russian Empire was impossible. But if Germany made the first move to support the Tsar in his time of need, before the rest of Europe could react, especially the French, then would that not be a sign of friendship, rather than the previous animosity shared between them? As for Alfred von Schlieffen and August von Mackensen, they were far more observant of the words Bruno had used. They understood immediately that Bruno had used Mukden as a way to foster as much hatred against the Tsar as possible, no doubt as an attempt to lure out the Marxist leaders from hiding and exile so that he could obliterate them now rather than worry about them being a nuisance later on. It was clear to them both that for whatever reason Bruno had an immense hatred for Marxism and those who adhered to its ideology. They did not necessarily know why this was the case, but they now understood that Bruno was playing a game of chess on a global stage, and he was about 100 turns ahead of everyone else. To accurately predict everything that had come to pass, and to make moves in preparation for it. It was truly a masterful display. But it was not until August von Mackensen spoke up did everyone realize the full extent of Bruno's preparations. And I presume, this is where you say that we should ship all of our old rifles to the Tsar and his forces so that we can purchase those new semi-automatic weapons Waffenwerk von Zehntner is developing to replace them? Bruno was obviously surprised by this statement, as was everyone else in the room. But he was surprised for reasons that were different from the others. That is, until the old general chuckled at his expressions before explaining how he knew about this matter. What, kid? You didn't know that your father once served beneath my command? We have remained in contact over the years, and he has told me all about those new rifles. They are your design, are they not? A functional semi-automatic rifle chambered in the 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser cartridge for standard infantry use that could prove to be reliable in the field? When did such a thing come into existence? And Bruno had designed these rifles? Very few people knew about this matter. Sure, they had been in development since 1901, and were only now reaching a state of functionality where they could undergo thorough field testing. As a result, it had not even been brought up as a matter to the military or the politicians in the Bundesrat. Thus why everyone was shocked by this sudden revelation, and curious about what the two generals were talking about. A discussion that revealed how long Bruno had been preparing for this day. Of course, nobody could know that these preparations were not made for the Russian Revolution, but the Great War that was to come in the following decade. Chapter 56, Formation of the Iron Brigade Part 1. Following the discussion between Bruno and the rest of the German High Command, a correspondence was made between the Kaiser and the Tsar, where the German Reich presented an unexpected offer to send rifles, munitions, and artillery to the Russian Empire and its forces, one that the Tsar was quick to accept as a token of friendship. After all, the war was not going as well for him as he had wanted the rest of the world to believe. In the months since Mukden, the Bolsheviks had grown in numbers, from initially a few thousand rioters to tens of thousands of revolutionaries. With the disaster at Mukden causing the loss of roughly 300,000 Russian soldiers, the remaining 400,000 or so soldiers who had been stationed in the east were immediately transferred west for the purpose of combating the Bolshevik Revolution. But the Marxists were bold, choosing to fight not in the field, but in the streets where they could blend in with ordinary civilians. All the while loyalist militias patrolled the same streets, taking the brunt of the casualties which the Marxists inflicted upon the Tsarist forces via ambushing tactics. Considering the Tsar couldn't very well shell his own towns, which the rebels inhabited, the result was that the Russian army had to force their way into the homes of private citizens in an attempt to gather evidence of revolutionary activity where those apprehended would be executed publicly via firing squads. Of course, this created even more problems than it solved. Not only did this cause further resentment to the Tsar and his loyalists from the Russian people, but also spurred many of the soldiers in the Russian army to defect to the Red Army. No doubt these men were already disgruntled by their poor performance in Manchuria and upset over the Tsar's inability to avenge their fallen brothers at Mukden. But this was the final straw. Because of this, the German army and the rest of the world were watching Russia with great interest as the war continued to devolve into further chaos. Currently, Bruno was standing in the Central Division of German High Command, where he was commenting on the progression of the conflict. Despite initial efforts over the past month to ship weapons to the Tsar and his forces, many of the weapons delivered had ended up in the hands of the Red Army rather than their intended targets. Whether this happened via traitors in the ranks of the Russian army's logistics network, or was simply caused by defectors who accepted the stockpiles of German weapons before outright abandoning their posts to join the enemy, it didn't really matter. At the end of the day, only a fraction of the equipment shipped to Russia was now in the hands of the Tsarist forces. Because of this, Bruno pushed the wooden pieces representing the Red Army's forces into position outside St. Petersburg on the map, where much of the Marxist activity was taking place. He made a bold prediction to the other generals of the German army, one that they found hard to believe. By the time winter ends, St. Petersburg will have fallen into Bolshevik hands, as will most of Ingria. If that were to happen, then the Tsar will lose one of his major ports and, by extension, access to the Baltic. Moreover, a Bolshevik capture of St. Petersburg would mean that friendly forces overseas, and you know the ones I am talking about, will be able to actively contribute to the Red Army's war efforts, thus creating further problems for the Tsar and his forces. While it was hard to believe that the Russian city of St. Petersburg would fall into the hands of the Bolsheviks, things had ultimately changed in this timeline. The Russian Revolution of 1905 started a year early and was far more akin to the conflict in 1917, which itself would spiral into Russian civil war during Bruno's past life. Because of this, Bruno wanted to put an end to this rebellion before it engulfed the entirety of the Russian Empire, and worse yet spread Marxist sentiment to Europe. As had happened after the Russian Empire, and the briefly lived Russian Republic collapsed towards the end of the Great War in his past life. After expressing this sentiment, and his reasonings as to why the fall of St. Petersburg would be a significant victory for the Marxists, it would appear that Bruno's words had convinced several of the other German generals of his predictions, or at the very least, they recognized the threat it would pose. With this in mind, August von Mackensen took the lead, as he asked Bruno how he planned to handle the situation which he predicted should it actually come to pass in reality. So, if St. Petersburg falls into the hands of the Bolsheviks, this little revolution will turn into something that may spell the end of the Russian Empire, won't it? If that's the case, how do you plan to handle the situation? Bruno looked at the aging general as if the answer was completely and utterly obvious, which he was quick to voice. Well, direct military intervention in the conflict may provoke an international response, one which I am sure the Kaiser does not desire in the slightest. After all, the rest of Europe sees this revolution as something minor. For the German Reich to stick its nose in the Tsar's business, especially after the strained relations that our two nations have had over the course of the past few years. This would no doubt be seen as an unprovoked attempt to exert pressure on the Russian Empire. So the idea of sending our own troops to aid the Tsar is out of the question. However, that does not mean there aren't alternative options to ensure these Marxists are crushed. For example, there is no treaty that prevents foreign volunteers from taking up arms on behalf of the Tsar. In the last century, it was not uncommon for citizens to take up arms and form their own freikorps during times of great distress, was it not? Why not enlist the aid of such volunteers and have them deal with the Marxists? August von Mackensen immediately understood Bruno's intentions, even if the man had not outright stated them aloud. The plan was for the German army to send active-duty soldiers to Russia under the guise of them being volunteers. No doubt the Tsar would accept these volunteers, as by now he needed all the manpower he could get. With this, Bruno had provided the solution to any potential diplomatic crisis that may have emerged should the German Reich send its own army to Russia. Even if the French wanted to complain about these so-called volunteers, the Kaiser could simply state that he and his army had nothing to do with it, and any arms which these volunteers were using to fight the Red Army were instead supplied by the Russians. No doubt from the hefty stockpiles war aid that the Germans had already given the Tsar. This was of course a tactic borrowed from Germany in Bruno's past life. In the 1930s, Germany had sent plenty of Wehrmacht units into Spain under the guise of being volunteers. These soldiers played a critical part in winning the war on behalf of the nationalists. Afterward, they were welcomed back into active service with open arms and even granted medals for their actions in Spain. It was an act that not only the Germans had engaged in, but so too did their rivals on the global stage who supported the Republicans instead. When August von Mackensen realized what Bruno's plans were, he couldn't help but admire the man's cunning. This was a shrewd maneuver to avoid responsibility for any actions taken by these volunteer units while they were in Russia. one which he could only shake his head and chuckle at, as the aging field marshal posed the question which he already knew the answer to. And who do you propose will lead these volunteers into Russia? It was a question that was obvious to everyone in the room. Bruno's hidden meaning had been seen through. Many of those present had guessed that this had probably been the man's goal all along. And when Bruno spoke his intent aloud, nobody disagreed with the words he had said. Since I was the one who proposed this plot, then it is only right for me to take full responsibility for the operation. That is, of course, assuming that the Kaiser will approve of it. If anyone asks why an active duty member of the German Army's General Staff is in command of this volunteer force, you could say that I resigned from my post to lead these men into battle. After all, I am sure that fabricating some discharge papers is not an impossibility, no? Bruno's words had confirmed the general's suspicions. The man had long since come up with this idea in preparation not only for removing Marxism from this world altogether, but also as a scheme to mend the relationship between the German Reich and the Russian Empire. In addition to this, Bruno would no doubt be earning the Tsar's pardon for the acts he had taken against Russian troops in northern China during the Boxer Rebellion all those years ago, as well as his actions in Manchuria that led to the defeat of the Russian army sent to the region. After all, such petty grievances paled in comparison to ensuring a monarch retained his throne, did they not? Considering the fact that Bruno appeared to have properly thought this matter through, the German generals saw no reason to prevent the man from leading this so-called Free Corps, and immediately granted him the resignation he had requested, with General Feldmarschall Alfred von Schlieffen personally announcing it then and there. All right, General-Lieutenant Bruno von Zehntner, as the Chief of Staff of His Majesty's Army, I hereby accept your resignation. Should you wish to return to active service, you are free to do so at your leisure, where your rank and status will be fully reinstated. After saying this, Bruno saluted the man and thanked him. Immediately thereafter, he would be working to organize and equip the Free Corps, which would consist of at least a single brigade of 5,000 infantrymen, as well as an attached artillery regiment of 48 guns and 1,000 men. In addition to organizing the Free Corps, as well as ensuring the logistics were set up to transfer them and their equipment to Russia, Bruno would also have to design new uniforms for the Free Corps units sent to Russia. But Bruno just so happened to be heavily invested in German textile corporations and was thus capable of producing these uniforms with limited effort on his part. Considering that Bruno would be invoking the spirit of those brave veterans who during his past life fought to prevent a communist takeover of the German fatherland following the collapse of the monarchy and the rise of Marxist revolutionary movements within the Weimar Republic, there was really only one appropriate name to give his new Free Corps unit, and that was the Iron Brigade, a name which would soon be remembered throughout history for its brutality and ruthlessness within the Russian Empire, specifically in its efforts to stamp out Marxism wherever they may find its adherents lurking in the shadows. Chapter 57. Formation of the Iron Brigade Part 2. The organization, equipment, and deployment of the Iron Brigade was something that would take several months to organize, which Bruno had anticipated well in advance. After all, there was a reason he proposed its creation in October of 1904, rather than waiting for the following spring when the Bolsheviks would have already occupied St. Petersburg and its port. As for the Tsar, he was quickly alerted to the formation of the Iron Brigade, and that roughly 6,000 German volunteers, consisting of an infantry brigade and an attached artillery regiment, would be sent to Russia to aid in the war effort. The numbers seemed rather lacking as far as the Tsar was concerned, especially when the enemy's numbers were quickly approaching the 100,000 mark, and showed no signs of slowing down, but at the end of the day, any help was welcome. In addition to this, the Kaiser also promised to send more volunteers should the enemy continue to grow in size and scale. It was unknown exactly the extent to which the German Reich was willing to help the Tsar retain his throne, but from the sound of it, the Germans were willing to send far more than they were initially deploying to the Russian motherland. However, a matter of contention appeared when the Kaiser announced who was going to be leading the so-called Iron Brigade, with the Tsar questioning the sanity of his cousin for sending the man who had caused these problems to begin with. Nevertheless, the Tsar received the Kaiser's guarantee that Bruno would make up for his actions in China and Manchuria, and that he would prove to be a valuable asset in the field. one which the Tsar could use as he pleased. Ultimately, considering Bruno's fearsome reputation, the Tsar relented, making a promise to the Kaiser hat he may end up regretting, insofar as stating that should Bruno actually play a significant role in his victory, then the man would not just pardon the German general for past crimes against the Russian Empire, but also would reward him handsomely. As for Bruno, he wasted no time, making a list of the soldiers, officers, and equipment he desired for use in the ongoing Bolshevik Revolution. He also drafted a uniform for his volunteer brigade. In the 19th century, during the Napoleonic Wars, there was a Prussian unit of Freikorps with a uniform that had the colors of black, red, and silver, which coincided with another infamous unit from German history, one that if Bruno had his way would not come into existence within this timeline. Even so, Bruno had taken inspiration from these two units for his new uniforms, ones which borrowed this color scheme and some symbolism from the two of them, while applying it to the uniforms used by German soldiers in the early years of the Great War. However, Bruno did not issue his troops the Pickelhaube, rather making use of the Krachenfeldmutzen field cap. Like the uniform, its primary color was black. The band around the bottom of the cap was also black, but with a red lining. As for the symbol embedded in its center, it was the infamous Death's Head, or Totenkopf used by Freikorps units and Hussars in the past. Above the Totenkopf, on top portion of the cap was the Reichskokard, which was a small circular badge in the colors of red, white, and black, which symbolized the unified German Empire. Officer variants had a black leather visor and a matching black leather strap. In addition to this, Bruno's uniform had the collar tabs of a German Generalleutnant, but rather than being gold embroidered, they were instead in silver, as well as the red stripes on the sides of his black slacks that were commonly found on the uniforms of German generals. Overall, the uniform was black, with red embellishment and silver fittings. In addition to this, there was an armband worn on the right side that was in the colors of the German Empire's national flag, similar to those worn by some colonial soldiers. As for Bruno's load-bearing equipment, officers like himself would wear a black leather belt with a cross strap, as well as a holster for his pistol and several magazine pouches. The belt buckle was made of silver and had a Totenkopf on it, which was the symbol of this newly formed Iron Brigade. Meanwhile, the soldiers and NCOS who carried Gur 98 rifles would wear an actual web harness based on the designs that Bruno had made to replace the current issue German load-bearing equipment whenever the Gur 43 entered service. The difference being their magazine pouches had instead been replaced with K98K style pouches for the use of stripper clips. It was also made of black leather, rather than the brown leather that would later be standard issue to the German army. All in all, the uniforms of the Iron Brigade would be different enough from those of the Imperial German Army to be able to avoid confusion, while still German enough in design that nobody misunderstood who they were and where they were from. After making sure the new uniforms were designed and the basic organization of the Iron Brigade was settled, Bruno would spend his days at the Central Division of German High Command, aiding in recruitment efforts from among the ranks of the German Army and Navy. Unsurprisingly, Heinrich and Erich immediately volunteered to join Bruno's escapades. They had always had the man's back in the past, and despite this venture not officially being a part of the German army, they knew this would be a good chance to gain a promotion. However, shockingly, there were two other faces which Bruno was familiar with who joined the volunteer brigade, which happened to be his two older brothers, Ludwig and Kurt, who were also still in the army, albeit towards the end of their careers. When the two men approached Bruno in order to ask his permission to join, no doubt the man was skeptical. However, the reasoning they gave him was satisfactory, with Ludwig surprisingly being the first to bow his head and ask for forgiveness. "Bruno, I'm sorry, Generalleutnant. I'd like to apologize for what I have done over the years. It shames me to admit it, but I have always been jealous of you and what you have been able to achieve despite being my younger brother. But it wasn't until we were at the most recent family gathering where I finally understood this. Seeing you gain such praise from not only our family, but so many powerful figures. It made me realize that this stupid metal pin to my chest is worthless compared to what you, my younger brother, have accomplished. I mean, everyone who was in service at the time was rewarded with one of these. But when the opportunity to go to China came up, I passed on it. Yet you didn't. You who were fresh out of the academy volunteered to go off and fight in a foreign land. and in doing so, you made a name for yourself. While I'm still a nobody, simply the eighth son of a powerful nobleman. It was my lack of determination that prevented me from doing the same. If you will have me, I would be honored to fight by your side in Russia so that we can put an end to these filthy peasants and their revolt against their rightful monarch once and for all. Although Ludwig had misunderstood the reason why Bruno hated these Marxists so much as to resign from his position as a general and instead volunteer to fight in a foreign war just to eliminate them all. The fact that he was willing to apologize and admit his mistakes was good enough of a reason to let the man join him in this one last campaign. After all, Bruno knew his brothers were nearing the end of their military service, and unlike him, they didn't appear to wish to make an entire career out of it. Because of this, Bruno was more than welcome to let the man prove to their family that he too was capable of winning glory. At the same time, Bruno wanted someone else in his family to understand that war was far from as glorious and honorable as they imagined it to be. Only his father somewhat understood what Bruno had been through. And because of this, Bruno was more than happy to accept Ludwig's support. I trust that you have at least retained some memory of how to operate in the field from your days at the academy. If so, I am willing to put aside any past grievances we have had as brothers and allow you to prove yourself in battle. Ludwig immediately saluted his younger brother, having not expected the man to actually forgive him or grant him this one last opportunity for the glory he so desired. As for Kurt, he seemed to be mulling over whether or not he should actually apologize as well, which, of course, his silence caught Bruno's gaze. In the end, he too lowered his head and, with a heavy sigh, made a heartfelt apology. Once he had done so, Bruno too accepted him into the ranks of his volunteer brigade, while also taking a moment to remind his brothers of what they were getting into. Though I am more than happy to let bygones be bygones, and let you too prove your worth. To our family, I must remind you that this isn't some camping trip we will be embarking on. This will be war, and a civil war, no less. You should know that the most brutal, bloody, and inhumane wars ever fought in history have been civil wars. What I will ask you to do will test your humanity. For the undertaking we are about to engage in, I will require monsters, not men. For to defeat the evil that is Marxism, we will have to abandon our morality and become an even greater demon to our enemies. If you cannot find it within yourself to follow my orders without question, no matter how cruel and ruthless they may be, then you should leave now while you still can. Because once you sign up for the Iron Brigade, there will be no leaving it until the war has been won. Bruno gave his brothers a fair warning. After all, he planned to show no mercy to the Bolsheviks or anyone else who professed to adhere to such a toxic ideology, much in the way that the Reds had shown such disregard for the lives of the Tsar and his entire bloodline in Bruno's past life, or the 100 million plus people who followed them to the grave in the name of Marxism over the course of the next century. To put it simply, Bruno had no sympathy, no empathy, and no remorse for Marxists. They were as evil as the devil himself in his eyes, and such evil needed to be replaced with death. When it came to Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, Maxim Litvinov, and the other leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution, there would be no leniency granted to them. Rather, their deaths would be so cruel, so vicious, so ruthless, that by the time this war had been won in favor of the Tsar, Bruno would earn himself another nickname that would strike fear into the hearts of his enemies for years to come. Chapter 58, Formation of the Iron Brigade Part 3. Heidi knew something was wrong the moment Bruno began spending his days around the house. At first, she thought that perhaps the man had gotten some extra time of leave for reasons unknown to her. But in the end, she knew this was too good to be true. Sure, she had her ways to find out just what exactly Bruno was up to, but she did not want to go behind the man's back to find out. Rather, she trusted when the time came he would tell her himself. And because of this, she waited patiently, all the while fulfilling her role as a loving wife and mother. The upside of spending time at his home while organizing the formation of the Iron Brigade was the fact that Bruno had managed to be around his children much more. They were, after all, too young to go to school, and because of this they spent their time at home, being raised by their mother. Now that he was home for the majority of the day, other than a few weekly visits to the Central Division in order to report the updates of his project to his superiors, Bruno found himself taking breaks quite frequently to play with his daughters and to teach his young son valuable lessons. As the weeks passed, Bruno found that he had more volunteers from the German Navy than he initially expected. In particular, the German Sea Battalion, which was the Imperial German Naval Infantry, in other words, their version of Marines, had well over 24 volunteers join the unit. This made sense when Bruno considered the small scale of the Sea Battalion and the fact that they really didn't have much to do, as only one of its 2 battalions had been deployed to defend German colonists in the Herero Wars. In fact, now that it was mid-October 1904, Bruno was all too aware of what had happened in the region. It did, after all, cause some major drama at the Central Division of German High Command. In an act of rebellion, the Khoi and Herero tribes had massacred 125 German settlers in what would be known as Namibia in the 21st century. In retaliation, General Lothar von Trotha had ordered the extermination of the Herero tribes by killing all the men, as well as forcing the women and children into the desert where they would die from dehydration or exposure. It was no doubt an act of cruelty, but considering the Herero tribes had murdered innocent German settlers, Bruno quite frankly considered it not necessarily justified per se, but more so the natural result that would occur when a colonial subject performed such a heinous act against their masters. In addition to this, Bruno was well aware of Lothar von Trotha's character, having served beneath the man in China during the Boxer Rebellion. Well, not exactly directly, as Bruno was only a captain at the time who answered to a lieutenant colonel. But the man was in charge of the East Isa Expeditionary Corps, which Bruno was a part of, and thus could have been considered the boss of Bruno's boss. At the time, Lothar was the colonel whose response was to immediately throw Bruno into confinement after the incident with the Russian brigands. His character was fierce and temperamental, often choosing punitive action in the strictest manner before fully getting a grasp on the situation. Naturally, the order from German High Command when they discovered that Lothar had effectively ordered an act of genocide was to repeal it. But Lothar simply pretended like he did not receive the orders of the Chief of Staff, and by extension the Kaiser. No doubt he was currently carrying out his genocide. And as much as Bruno should have sympathy for the victims, he could really only find the blame lying with the Herero people. I mean, had they not taken up arms and butchered innocent colonists who were living peaceful lives and were by no means a part of the colonial army which the natives had their grievance against, then this tragedy would have never befallen them. It really was a self-inflicted tragedy. And quite frankly, Bruno was of the mindset that if you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. No matter how horrible the consequences may be, it was the result of the natives' own violence towards an occupying force that had the strength to easily wipe them out. What exactly did they expect to happen? At the end of the day, it was an undeniable law of nature that might is right. If the natives did not have the power to repel the German army, then what happened to them as a result of their rebellion was simply nothing that Bruno would shed a tear over, even if it did result in an excessive retaliation such as extermination. So Bruno simply carried on with his day, not giving a second thought to an act that many would consider a stain on Germany's history. Because at the end of the day, should he win the Great War and establish German hegemony in Europe, then history would remember this incident not as a fault of the German Reich, but rather that of the Herero people who suffered the consequences of their own murderous actions. Because at the end of the day, the concepts of human rights and equality were not the natural progression of human civilization, unlike what so many people believed during Bruno's past life. Rather, it was the direct result of America's hegemony over the world following the end of the Second World War. The military might of the United States and its repeated crackdown on those who opposed their beliefs across the world throughout the 20th and 21st centuries was the reason that liberalism had become the norm in Western civilization. Had the Central Powers emerged victorious in the Great War, or had the Axis won the Second World War, then the norms which were often taken for granted in Western civilization during the 21st century would have been replaced entirely with a very different system of values. And that was all that needed to be said. So, after putting such petty matters into the back of his mind, Bruno returned his attention back to the creation of his Iron Brigade. The obvious choice of a standard infantry weapon was the Gur 98 rifle. Manufactured in significant numbers, the Reich could easily spare a few thousand of them to be given to the German volunteers. However, Because he had months to form the Iron Brigade and deploy to Russia, Bruno wanted to make a few minor modifications to these rifles. To put it simply, Bruno could not stand the iron sights on the standard-issue Gur 98. They were simply atrocious according to his more modern sensibilities. It was because of this he had his family's company refurbish the rifles that were to be fielded by the Iron Brigade, specifically so they could be converted into the G98M variation, which were manufactured in the interwar period of his previous life and issued to nationalists during the Spanish Civil War, as well as in limited numbers to the Waffen-SS at the start of the Second World War. As for artillery, the Krupp 7.5 cm Model 1903 was selected for use by the Iron Brigade. For starters, it was not a cannon actually issued to the German army, or at least in any significant capacity. Rather, it was used as an export weapon to other nations, such as Serbia, Japan, Romania, etc. In this timeline, the Germans had sent this weapon to the Japanese during their war with the Russians in Manchuria as a means of aid, and by now was also being shipped to the Russians as well. It was Krupp's answer to the Canon de 75 Modèle 1897, which was a French weapon that had made the German artillery of the previous century obsolete. However, the 7.5 cm Model 1903 lost in military trials against the Waffenwerk von Zehntner 7.5 cm FK 1901, which was Bruno's design based upon the interwar era 7.5 cm FK 16 Na from his past life, which was now being mass-produced for military service. Of course, the 7.5 cm Model 1903 was adopted in limited numbers for the purpose of counter-espionage. Its sole purpose was to basically be used as a display piece for potential spies to observe and report incorrect information to their nation. Because of this, in the export models, Krupp was producing enough to easily supply the Iron Brigade in their wars abroad. Finally, there was one other piece of equipment being employed by the Iron Brigade in this war, and that was the MG-01, or more specifically, the MG January 3rd, which was a variant in this timeline that Waffenwerk von Zehntner manufactured to fulfill the needs of the German army, who had begun investing heavily into machine guns before the MG-34 was ready for mass production. In other words, it was an MG-08 with a tripod mount rather than the notorious sledge mount. And it also made use of a metallic belt like the PM M1910, which the Russians would adopt in 1910. This was in contrast to the cloth belt that the Germans and other nations adopted for their variants of the Maxim gun, also known by the nickname of the Devil's Paintbrush, due to the millions of young men whose blood it spilled across no man's land during the Great War of Bruno's past life. It was because this machine gun was in ready supply and was highly capable of performing the roles Bruno needed it to that he had selected it for service within the Iron Brigade. After all, the German Reich was the only nation currently investing heavily into machine gun development and production, as most nations still had not understood their value on the battlefield, even after their prominent use during the Second Boer War and the Russo-Japanese War. And since this was the case, Bruno knew that the Red Army would not be able to get their hands on such devastating weapons. Perhaps if they were lucky, they could get one or two, but not enough to effectively counter the Iron Brigade, especially if Bruno fielded machine gunners at the platoon level. Thus, Bruno had finished the requisition forms for the specific equipment he wanted for his Iron Brigade, which he had no doubt would result in a victory for the Russian Tsar. If there was one concern Bruno had about deploying to Russia, it was simply this. He had no idea when this war would end, or how many communists he would have to butcher. In the process, surely he would not become known for painting the Russian landscape red with the blood of Marxists, right? Chapter 59, Entering the Russian Civil War. Tsar Nicholas II stood in his palace, gazing out the windows which displayed a vision of his palace gardens and the city of St. Petersburg below. The Winter Palace was the official residence of the House of Romanov and had been since 1732. It was a large and luxurious estate, the type that only the wealth of an entire empire could afford to build. You see, the thing was, the great European monarchs of the early modern era had built multiple palaces for themselves, each one of which was so grand in size, scale, and opulence that the world's wealthy merchant elite of the 21st century could only gaze upon them with envy, as their meager fortunes could not possibly construct such an abode for themselves. And from Bruno's perspective, or at least during that of his past life, when he went by the name of Karl. The world would never see such a grand display of architectural achievement ever again. But the year was 1904, and winter was vastly approaching. It was because of the era that the House of Romanov thought nothing of how grand their estates were. It was perhaps because the Tsar took his wealth for granted, while his people lived in a state of relative destitution, that things had progressed as far as they had with the ongoing Bolshevik Revolution, one which was starting to spiral into a full-scale civil war. A month had passed since the Kaiser first announced the formation of the German volunteer force known as the Iron Brigade. And according to the most recent reports from the Tsar's generals, the so-called Red Army had nearly tripled in size. Previously being 100,000 men strong, they now had more than 250,000 forces at their disposal. Defections from the Tsar's army had not helped the matter, and these ragtag Marxists were now gaining valuable training from the veterans of the Russo-Japanese War, which had only concluded a few months prior. With all of this in mind, the Tsar was starting to consider the idea of abandoning his family's home, the estate which had housed them for multiple generations, and instead of fleeing further east to a city where Bolshevik activity was less intense. Meanwhile, one of the Tsar's generals approached him. The man went by the name of Anatoly Mikhailovich Stessel, and he was the man now in charge of the Russian army, after the previous general in charge had been removed from his post, what with being held responsible for Russia's defeat in Manchuria. Anatoly Stessel was a man of German descent, and it was perhaps because of this that he was slightly more sympathetic to the German Reich than other Russian military leaders. But at the moment, he had a rather ugly expression on his face as he announced the latest news to the Tsar. "Your Majesty, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the Red Army has amassed 50,000 men who are marching to St. Petersburg as we speak. They plan to encircle the city and besiege it. It would be best if you and your family escaped now, rather than being caught in the city. I assure you that my men and I will fight to the last man to prevent your home from falling into the hands of these damned peasants." So, the time had finally come. The Red Army was finally bearing its fangs in ways other than mere ambushes in the streets. 50,000 men sought to encircle St. Petersburg and seize it for themselves. What was next? All of Ingria? The Tsar's worst fears had been realized, and he was quick to sigh heavily, ultimately nodding his head in agreement with the general's proposal as he did so. "Very well. I will have the servants begin packing immediately. My family and I will flee to the safety of Siberia, where the Reds have yet to spread their influence. I trust you to ensure that this city does not fall into the hands of the rebels, General." After saying this, the Tsar walked off without saying another word. The city of St. Petersburg was about to come under siege, and there was no telling how the Tsar's soldiers left in the city would handle the situation. Within the week, the Tsar and his family would indeed flee to Siberia, where they hoped to wait out of the rest of the war safe and sound. Meanwhile, his supporters in St. Petersburg would be forced to endure a siege that would be remembered throughout history as being particularly brutal. By the end of December, Bruno's recruitment efforts had been fully manifested. The Iron Brigade was now composed of 6,000 men. 5,000 infantry and 1,000 artillery soldiers from the German Army and Naval Infantry had volunteered to enter Russia and fight on behalf of the Tsar to end the Bolshevik Revolution and the spread of communism once and for all. Bruno had said goodbye to his family, assuring them that he would be home safe and sound before they knew it. After one last farewell to his wife and kids, he stepped out of his home, dressed in the uniform of the Iron Brigade, where he would be sent on a train to the city of Danzig. In Danzig's port lie Russian transport vessels which were docked and waiting to carry Bruno and his men to St. Petersburg. When Bruno arrived in Danzig, he saw his men all lined up. Considering they would be fighting in Russia during the winter, Bruno had gone out of his way to provide proper winter clothing to his soldiers. The last thing he needed was for them to end up freezing to death due to the severity of the weather. Because of this, the men were dressed from head to toe in warm wool clothing, and they sported flashy greatcoats modeled after the 1915 design used in the Great War by German soldiers in Bruno's past life. Of course, these greatcoats, like everything else the soldiers wore, were black. In addition to this, the soldiers wore puttees to keep the mud and snow out of their boots and from affecting their feet. Not only that, But knowing that they would be walking into battle against the Red Army, who by now had captured artillery from the Russian army, Bruno decided to mitigate casualties by introducing a piece of equipment that could save many lives. I'm talking, of course, about the Stahlhelm, specifically the Model 1916 variant used during the Great War of Bruno's past life. It was painted black and emblazoned with the white, red, and black coat of arms of the German Reich on the sides of it. When foreign nations observed the conflict and noticed the effectiveness of issuing soldiers a steel helmet and preventing head injuries from shrapnel, it would no doubt spur the other major powers to develop their own, something that would once more change the timeline. But the lives of Bruno's soldiers were something precious to him, and since he was given control over the outfitting of his soldiers, he had not neglected this important asset. Because of this equipment, all of which was modeled after that used by German soldiers in the Great War, which would not occur until another 10 years had passed. The Iron Brigade looked almost futuristic to those civilians who cheered for these brave souls who were going to fight abroad to protect a foreign monarch from the dangers of communism. All the while women threw flowers at their feet as they prepared to deploy to fight in a foreign land. After all, the press had been posting many negative things about the Red Army, some of which was truth, others were exaggerations, while a minority were blatant propaganda. But the German papers which printed such news had shifted the perspective of the Reich citizens in regards to Marxism and all of its derivatives. To put it simply, anyone who proclaimed themselves to be a Marxist, a socialist, a communist, etc., would be given dirty looks by the common man. And this was no doubt a method of Bruno's influence, who had bought significant shares in every facet of the Reich's media with the fortune he had gained. Influencing public opinion was a powerful tool, one which he intended to employ to gather support for the Kaiser and to demonize his enemies in the coming years. Only now was Bruno beginning to make use of these methods, and its effects were already starting to take place. As for Bruno, the moment he stood before his personal army of 5,000 soldiers, he saluted them all, while making a brief speech to them. I wanted to take a moment to thank you all for volunteering for this expedition to the Russian motherland. No doubt each and every one of you is a patriot of the highest order, because, contrary to common belief, we are not simply marching to a foreign country to fight a war that has no interest in the German Reich and its citizens. Instead, I would assert that the ideology of Marxism is an enemy to all of humanity, as are those who practice it, and as humans ourselves, no doubt it is in our interest to combat this toxic and deadly ideology wherever it may appear in this world. The Bolsheviks have taken up arms against the Tsar. They intend to plunge the Russian Empire into a state of anarchy, all with the intent of overthrowing a perfectly functional society in the name of their anti-human doctrine, one which will no doubt require the deaths of millions of innocents to enforce. It is because of this fact that we stand here today as the vanguard against Marxism. In the name of Kaiser, God, and Fatherland, I beseech you to stand firm and fight the enemies of the German Reich and its people. The Iron Brigade responded to Bruno's brief speech with a chant of their own, God with us, after which they would board the Russian transport ships and embark towards St. Petersburg, which by now was already neck-deep in a pile of corpses as the Russian army desperately defended against the Bolshevik siege. Chapter 60, Arriving in St. Petersburg. Gunfire echoed throughout the background, with the occasional sound of artillery fire going off in the distance. St. Petersburg was covered in snow, the bodies of the dead lying in the streets frozen to the point where they could no longer be a matter of concern when it came to the spreading of disease. In the months since the Tsar and his family fled the city, the battle between the Red Army and those who remained loyal to the Emperor had reached peak intensity. The Reds had dug in outside of the city, with each of their assaults being repelled by the Russian army and the Black Hundreds militias which supported them. Despite the Reds' attempts to break through the city's defenses resulting in abject failure and significant losses with each assault, the Russian loyalists who bravely put their lives on the line to prevent the Bolsheviks from coming in had suffered equally as dearly for their efforts, if not more so. To put it simply, the state of St. Petersburg was miserable, but at least they could rely on imports from the Reich to keep everyone fed. Because of this, while in a dreadful state, desperation had not yet kicked in among the civilian population. As General Anatoly Stessel stood within the safety of the city, gazing upon the enemy fortifications through his binoculars while smoking a cigarette. One of his subordinates came running up to him. The man appeared as haggard and grizzled as the general himself, both of which were covered in mud, blood, and snow, while clearly showing no signs of grooming over the course of the past month. The young officer saluted the general while making a report to him that was sure to lift the spirits of not only Anatoly but the city as a whole. "Sir, the German volunteers have arrived, and they appear to have brought a significant amount of heavy weapons to support the defense of the city." Anatoly lowered his binoculars and gazed at the officer in shock for several moments. He was not expecting the arrival of this so-called Iron Brigade for at least another 2 weeks. They were early, but that was not something to be disappointed about. Rather, he quickly put out his cigarette by tossing it on the packed snow before stomping it with his feet. There was no possibility of anything catching fire in this weather, but at this point it was a point of habit for the man. He quickly began walking in the direction of the port while shouting orders at the officer who had alerted him to this most welcome news. "Well, don't just stand there. Come with me. I want to see this Iron Brigade myself." Bruno stood on the docks of St. Petersburg. A cigarette was in his mouth as he lit it up, taking a hefty drag, while gazing upon the city and its ruinous state. No doubt the Bolsheviks had brought in the big guns for this siege. In comparison, Bruno brought the smallest caliber of artillery he could manage, primarily because of its lightweight nature, which would be most useful in the transport of the weapons. Even so, he brought something like 36 guns with him, which was a lot of firepower to be wielded in battle, even though they were all in 75 millimeters and not something more significant. As the soldiers of the brigade began to unload their equipment with the aid of the Russian dock workers, they were approached by the Russian army, or more specifically, the man in charge of it, as well as several of his subordinate officers, along with a personal bodyguard. Bruno could see the state which the Russian general was in, which no doubt if he looked so haggard and battle-worn, then Bruno dared not think what the average soldier was like at the moment. Bruno, however, forced a smile as he saluted the Russian general who outranked him and informed the man that his troubles had come to an end. "General, I'm happy to inform you that the siege has been lifted, or it will be soon enough once my men get into position." The general didn't necessarily believe this. By now, the Red Army had reinforced their losses, and a total of 80,000 men currently surrounded the city. Meanwhile, the initial 25,000 loyalist defenders had been whittled down to a mere 15,000. The next assault was guaranteed to bring them to their knees, even if the Germans boosted their total number to 21,000. Or so the general thought until that as he saw what the Germans were unloading from the transport ships. Bruno had brought with him 100 Maxim machine guns. After all, he equipped every platoon within the infantry brigade with a machine gun team. This meant that Bruno had brought more machine guns than existed in the entirety of the Russian army at the moment. Like the later Russian PM M1910 Maxim gun, the German guns used a fluted water jacket, the purpose of which was to cut some weight, albeit minimal amounts. Even so, it appeased Bruno's sense of aesthetics, which was his primary reason for instructing his family's company to manufacture their MG01/03S this way, which was the designation given to the improved machine guns that had been adopted by the German army following Bruno's suggestions to invest heavily in their development and manufacture. 100 machine guns and 36 75mm field guns. This was easily enough firepower to lift the siege. Of course, the general had yet to see the full amount of heavy weaponry Bruno was bringing into the field, but he had seen at least a dozen machine guns pulled out of crates. And because of this, he was quick to compliment the man. "If you have as many of those machine guns as I think you do, you may just be able to live up to your words." Bruno scoffed when he heard this remark, before ensuring the general he had far more of such weapons than he thought. "Oh, believe me, General, I have much more where these came from. But that's besides the point. What I need from you right now is to show me the defenses you have constructed around the city. I want to know where best to place my men in preparation for the next assault." Bruno received no complaint from the Russian general as the two marched across the frozen city streets and towards the front lines where Bruno could calculate a proper defensive strategy for the next wave. Though Bruno should probably be wearing his helmet, it was currently tied to his waist as he walked through the city and smoked. As they approached the front lines, Bruno heard the thunder of guns in the distance. From the sound of it, They were Russian 105mm siege guns. These weapons were already antiquated when they were used against the Japanese in Manchuria, having quite literally been designed in the late 1870s. Still, the shells landed nearby and detonated as the loyalist defenders quickly ran for cover. Even the Russian general by Bruno's side scurried off like a rat, at least until he saw Bruno just standing there smoking while gazing up at the shrapnel and snow, both of which fell from the sky. Once he saw that Bruno wasn't remotely shaken by the thunder of the guns whose shells were detonating nearby, the Russian general returned to his side. And shortly after that, the shells stopped firing. In the accompanying silence, Bruno chuckled before flicking his cigarette into the snow, after which he made a snide remark to the general before walking forward towards a vantage point he could use to properly prepare for what was soon to come. It's not the ones you hear that will get you. The meaning behind this was simple. An artillery shell traveled at such a speed that you would be dead from its detonation long before you heard the echo of it being fired in the distance. It was perhaps because of this that Bruno did not even bother to place his helmet on his head, let alone run for safety like the other soldiers nearby. When the Russian general heard these words, as well as the callous look on Bruno's face, he couldn't help but wonder just how many battles the German general had been through to look so fearless in the face of an oncoming artillery barrage. Something that would easily cause lesser men to break down should they endure such an assault. After staring in silence for some time, the man realized that Bruno had already advanced to a vantage point overlooking the battlefield, and quickly scurried off after him. He would go into extensive detail about the preparations he had made to defend the city from the Red Army, but Bruno did not hear a word of it. He was instead envisioning where he would put his machine guns, and where he would line up the Iron Brigade and their Tsarist allies in order to properly decimate the next wave of the Red Army's assault. There was a reason the Maxim machine gun was known by the nickname of the Devil's Paintbrush in Bruno's past life. But today the devil would not be the painter, rather it would be Bruno who assumed this role. After careful consideration, Bruno began to move his soldiers into positions, with the artillery having gone off and ceased. It was only a matter of time before the whistles blew and the charge began. When that happened, the Red Army would be in for a very rude awakening. Chapter 61. The Defense of St. Petersburg. A man sat in the trenches outside of St. Petersburg, cleaning his spectacles as he gazed through their lenses and towards the besieged city in the distance. After doing this, he looked down at his watch. He was quick to shift his gaze towards his fellow communist revolutionaries with an approving expression, rallying them with a speech before giving them the order to charge the enemy defenses, which by now were so battered that they would crumble under the might of the next assault. Brothers of the proletariat, the bourgeoisie and their foolish pawns rest on the wealth which they have stolen from us all. They fight not for some noble cause like we do, but to defend their vile actions towards the people of Russia. Today we bring an end to the tyranny of the Tsar and those wealthy industrialists who have made a fortune off of our labor. For the revolution. For Lenin. The man in question was quite to the contrary, not a member of the working class despite pretending as much, but rather, he was a man who was born into a wealthy Jewish family from the region of Ukraine. He was, of course, none other than Lev Davidovich Bronstein, more popularly known by the name of Leon Trotsky. He had personally chosen to lead the siege of St. Petersburg, hoping to achieve a great victory in the city, and in doing so, bring down the reign of the House of Romanov. No doubt entirely unaware that the Tsar and his family had already fled the city before his siege began. It was a similar lack of intelligence that allowed him to be so confident. He had no idea that the Iron Brigade had arrived with a regiment of 36 75mm modern field guns, as well as 100 machine guns which had been strategically placed throughout the city's defenses to ensure that not a single gap was available for the Bolshevik revolutionaries to make use of. With his barrage having been concluded against the loyalist defenders, now was the time to charge, and in doing so, end this war before it could continue any longer. With the blow of his whistle, Leon Trotsky announced the charge. Tens of thousands of the Red Army soldiers crawled out of the trenches and ran towards the city of St. Petersburg and the defenses which the Loyalists had made around it. Trotsky himself smiled gleefully as he saw the overwhelming numbers of Bolshevik revolutionaries rush towards victory. That is, until the unexpected happened. If Bruno was aware that one of his most hated figures in history was standing in the opposite trench, observing the battle that was about to take place, then he would have made capturing Trotsky a priority. But he was unaware that one of the leaders of the Bolsheviks was waiting on the other side of the battlefield. Because of this, prioritizing the city's defense and minimizing the casualties of his forces was the strategy which Bruno had opted for. It was clear that this was going to be the final charge that the Red Army made. They outnumbered the Loyalist defenders significantly and had thoroughly tested the city's fortifications over the past few months. Luckily, Bruno and his men arrived just in time to shatter the hopes of the Red Army and hopefully kill every last man and woman who dared to call themselves a communist. Thus, the moment the 80,000 or so Bolshevik revolutionaries charged towards the city's fortifications, Bruno gave the command to unleash hell upon them. The thunder of 36 75mm modern field guns, along with what remained of the Loyalists' antiquated artillery, opened fire on the charge's revolutionaries, battering their mass wave with more firepower than they initially expected to be used against them. However, the increase in artillery alone would not be able to overcome the odds. And though Trotsky's heart damn near stopped when he saw the explosions turn his men into meat paste, he ultimately realized that his forces would still be able to break through in the end. That is, of course, until they reached machine gun range. Once the endless sound of 8mm rounds chugging away at his forces appeared, the Bolshevik leader's eyes opened wide enough that they damn near fell out. All the while his pupils turned as thin as needles. Just where the hell did the Tsar's forces get their hands on so many machine guns? No. Damn it all. How the hell was this even possible? Trotsky began sweating bullets as he quickly pulled out his pair of binoculars and gazed upon the enemy defenses. It was only then he realized who had come to the Tsar's defense. An enemy he was not expecting to face. The black uniforms of the German Iron Brigade would have been an unknown quantity, if not for the fact that their helmets displayed the banner of the German Reich, while their armbands proudly did the same. The Germans? Why were the Germans here? Weren't they at odds with the Tsar? And where did they get so many machine guns? Trotsky's thoughts were racing as the echo of artillery, machine gun, and rifle fire combined into a symphony of death. All the while his men wailed and screamed as they were torn apart, their blood used to paint the snow where their bodies fell by the wayside. Bruno had not taken a position at the front line of the city's fortifications, though he did finally place his helmet upon his head. He simply observed from a distance further in the rear. No doubt his brothers and his friends were in the front, commanding the individual companies of soldiers who defended the trenches from the Russian onslaught. But 100 machine guns, firing 500 rounds per minute? Hell, the artillery wasn't even needed at this point. That was 50,000 rounds a minute flying in the face of 80,000 enemies, all with connected lines of fire. You see, in the Great War of Bruno's past life, machine gunners had learned a great trick. All they needed to do was gently tap the handles of the machine gun, and due to its tripod mount, it would immediately shift horizontally, just enough to deal with any enemies charging from the flanks. If set up properly, and with enough machine guns, one could make sure there was a constant spread of machine gun fire that affected all areas of no man's land. And by continuously using this method, it created a sea of death which no man could escape from. When considering the fact that Bruno had his machine gun teams to specifically practice such tactics repeatedly during the months leading up to this deployment, these men slaughtered the Red Army with little effort as they charged straight into the jaws of death. When combined with rifle fire from the trenches, the grenades that the Iron Brigade wielded whenever the enemy got close, and the rapid artillery fire of the 36 75mm guns in support, then the battle was over before it ever really begun. Bruno had ordered the deaths of 80,000 men, give or take. The numbers were slightly less when you considered that the officers of the Red Army hid in the relative safety of their own trenches while sending their soldiers to their deaths. And he had done so in the span of under 10 minutes. After which, Bruno blew his own whistle, while shouting towards the Iron Brigade, who climbed out of their own trenches and led the charge towards what remained of the Red Army. I want the enemy commander captured alive. As for everyone else, do your worst. For Kaiser and fatherland. The Russian loyalist soldiers were so bewildered by the slaughter that the German volunteers had unleashed on the enemy that it took them a few seconds to process that the Iron Brigade was performing a countercharge now that all remained of the enemy were a few hundred officers hiding in their trenches. And because of this, they were slightly behind the Germans as they too climbed out of their fortifications and charged through the sea of blood and body parts, all while trying to capture the enemy commander who had dared to lay siege to revolt against the crown. When Leon Trotsky witnessed what had happened to his army, he soiled himself in fear as he fell to his knees, crying like a bitch. All the while his hands shook, as the earth trembled beneath the charge of 21,000 loyalists, many of which were fanatically anti-Marxist, and would do horrible things to the officers of the Red Army when they got their hands on them. Fearing what would happen to him if he was captured alive, Leon reached into his holster and pulled out his revolver. His hands trembled as he tried to inspect whether any rounds were in the cylinder. So much so that the weapon fell from his grip and onto the ice within the trench, sliding away from him and the pool of urine he sat in. The mighty leader of the revolution cried as he got on his knees and crawled after the weapon, hoping he could get his hands on it before the enemy made it into the trenches. But it was too late. He froze on the spot as gunfire echoed from nearby, while the screams of his officers filled the air, either shot by the rifles of the Iron Brigade or run through by their bayonets. Leon Trotsky found himself surrounded by German soldiers, each of which wore wicked smirks on their faces as they pointed their rifles at one of the primary leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution, mocking him in German as they saw the sorry state he was in. No doubt, when the man was handed over to Bruno, he would be delighted to find that one of the men who he hated most throughout history had fallen into his hands. And when this happened, Leon Trotsky would be forced to endure a fraction of the suffering which his victims in Bruno's past life had undergone prior to their untimely deaths. Chapter 62. The Birth of a Martyr. Bruno stood in the snow-filled streets of St. Petersburg. The gunfire that had previously echoed across the region had come to a silent halt. The battle was won, and so quickly at that. 80,000 Reds lie dead in a sea of their own blood, the snow itself being stained with the overwhelming volume of the liquid which poured across it as a result of the hundreds of thousands of rounds that had been fired downrange in the span of 10 minutes. Bodies lie blast apart by the artillery shells, which impacted on their positions, as they foolishly charged against an entrenched and fortified position, one that had far more heavy weapons than they realized. And yet Bruno's hands were as still as the dead. The shakes he frequently gained were nowhere to be found. Why was this? Because it was not the sound of artillery and gunfire which haunted him on a subconscious level, nor was it the sea of corpses whose lives were taken by men acting on his orders. These things, they were calm, soothing even as the man had long since grown accustomed to them. Rather, it was the peaceful silence, the silence when the gunfire ends that terrified Bruno. He could not find a way to live with it. And because of this, here and now on the battlefield, or what remained of it, he was as calm as could be, callously counting the dead of those who followed him into battle. There was no silent prayer for the souls departed, nor a thought of the humanity lost. To him, they were simply numbers. It was while Bruno was counting the losses which they had suffered in the charge, which was far less than the enemy, that his soldiers approached him with a prisoner in tow. As Bruno had ordered, the officers who cowardly hid behind their own fortifications while sending their men to their deaths were executed upon capture. Only one man was permitted to live, the commander of the Red Army, or at least the field army which had surrounded and besieged St. Petersburg for the last few months. Bruno was surprised to find that the man who had so brazenly attacked such a significant city was none other than Leon Trotsky, a man he held great resentment for. The Red Army's commander was forced onto his knees in front of Bruno, who simply pulled out a cigarette and began to smoke as he gazed upon the hated face of his enemy, a man whose actions and ideals had caused the deaths of countless innocent souls in his past life. Leon was never a physically imposing or intimidating man, but he was more pathetic than history had depicted him, especially now, as he was crying, his eyes red and puffy from the overwhelming tears he had let loose since the moment he realized his army was destroyed. All the while his nose was dripping with snot, while his body trembled uncontrollably. He was bound by ropes with his arms behind his back. And when Bruno gazed upon the man, he was surprised to find that there was no anger nor hatred in his heart towards one of the founders of the Bolshevik Revolution. Nor was there any sense of disdain or contempt as there had previously been. Instead, there was nothing but indifference. Perhaps it was because Leon Trotsky, here and now, was not the man he had been in his past life. Sure, he was on the same path of destruction, death, and despair. But Bruno had stopped him from achieving infamy in history. Instead, as Bruno gazed upon the pathetic state of the would-be despot, he was just another poor soul to be sent to the afterlife by Bruno's hand. Because of this, Bruno exhaled a deep plume of smoke in Trotsky's face while he leaned down to stare at the man on a personal level. Perhaps if the man had the balls, he would spit in Bruno's face and curse him out. But it was clear by the way he was acting, he didn't have such manhood. No, the man kneeling before Bruno was a broken and defeated man. One who would only beg for mercy in the face of his death as if he had already been thoroughly castrated by his victorious opponent. And because of this, Bruno's lips curled into a cruel sneer as he posed a simple question to the one of the primary founders of the Bolshevik Revolution. "Do you know who I am, little man?" The last part was a personal insult, no doubt because of the man's insignificant stature, especially as he kneeled in tears and soiled trousers before his conqueror. Leon Trotsky stammered over his words, refusing to meet Bruno's sinister gaze as he trembled in fear, knowing all too well the man who had defeated him, and so swiftly at that. "You are the Wolf of Prussia." Bruno's smirk turned even more malicious as he got up to his feet and stared down upon the whelp, mocking him as he walked behind his prisoner's back, all while speaking a villainous monologue. "Oh, so you have heard of me. Then it should be no surprise to you why you have failed here in St. Petersburg. You see, the thing is I'm also all too aware of who you are. History is, of course, stained with the blood of your victims." Trotsky tried to turn his head around and gaze upon Bruno, who was behind him, but was quickly hit with the butt of the rifle, which belonged to one of the members of the Iron Brigade who had captured him, causing him to wince in pain as his head hit the snow, the chilling cold reminding him of what his fate was to become. Still, he had done this out of confusion. Victims? What victims? And the way which Bruno spoke, it was almost as if he was not addressing Leon in the present, rather from the perspective of the future. It was deeply confusing to the Bolshevik revolutionary, only further adding to the chaos in his mind as death loomed on the horizon, watching and waiting to claim his soul. Meanwhile, Bruno stood there in silence as took another drag off of his cigarette, at the same time reflecting on how he would handle this situation he had suddenly found himself in. He had, after all, not expecting Leon Trotsky of all people to be the commander of the Red Army, which now lay dead in the snow. And while Bruno contemplated in silence, Trotsky knelt in front of him, forced to gaze upon what remained of his army, which now painted the snow red with their blood, which he was only now realizing was on full display to him. It was a gruesome sight, one which the Bolshevik leader could not accurately describe with words. The sight of his failures, which had resulted in such a complete and utter massacre, caused the Bolshevik revolutionary to cry once more with his hands bound behind his back. After taking some time to think about how to proceed, Bruno suddenly pulled out his Luger from its holster and pointed it to the back of the man's head. He let out a large puff of smoke from his lungs before saying the final words that the communist leader would ever hear in this life. And they were ones that only added to the confusion he currently felt. "I have often thought about what I would do to you and Lenin if I were ever able to get my hands on either of you. I mean the suffering the two of you have caused in this world. It is truly on a scale that few humans are capable of comprehending. And yet millions of people around the globe venerate you as some kind of ideological saint. It is truly sickening, especially when other dictators, warlords, and maniacs who have committed far less evil in this world are so despised. However, despite my previous intentions, I have to admit, now that you are in my custody, you seem so pathetic. It is almost as if you are not even worth the hatred which I have held for you for all these years. I suppose I should thank you. Seeing you act like such a despicable and insignificant creature in the face of death has only confirmed that you are simply unworthy of provoking any emotion from me. Allow me to gift you with these parting words of advice. If you were ever given another chance at life, you would do well to reflect on what brought you to this point and how you can properly repent for your sins." Bang! The body of Leon Trotsky fell to the floor with the sound of a gunshot, his brains blown out all over the snow in front of where he had kneeled just moments before. All the while Bruno took one last drag from his cigarette before tossing the butt on the face of the corpse he had just made, without any concern to putting it out. It was his last gesture of disrespect towards a man undeserving of being remembered in history. All the while the soldiers of the Iron Brigade, the Black Hundreds, and Russian army gazed at Trotsky's corpse after his execution with conflicted feelings. Surely this was a sign that the Bolshevik Revolution was coming to an end, was it not? Unfortunately for them, the war had only just begun, and Trotsky's death at the hands of Bruno would make him a martyr in the eyes of those who shared his cause. In the coming days, hundreds of thousands of peasants would flock to the Red Army, easily replenishing their ranks from those who had died on this day. Chapter 63: The Invention of the Tachanka. The siege of St. Petersburg had come to a sudden and violent conclusion, one that onlookers from abroad were not expecting in the slightest. First and foremost, it was assumed that the city would fall, and with it all of Ingria soon after. If this had occurred, the Bolsheviks would have stolen a vital port from the Russians and would have been able to receive military aid from foreign interest groups which supported them. But in a rather shocking display of firepower, the 6,000-man-strong Iron Brigade almost single-handedly obliterated the enemy with an absurd degree of machine guns. It was still an era where machine guns were not adopted by any military other than the major powers, and even then, they were almost always deployed incorrectly, as if they were another artillery piece. In addition to this, they existed in such limited numbers they had no real effect to change the battlefield. But two things stuck out like a sore thumb to everyone who learned about what happened in St. Petersburg. 1. Machine guns were a far more valuable weapon of war than initially estimated. 2. The use of steel helmets to protect one's skull from shrapnel might actually be an investment worth looking into. Because of this, Bruno had, as he feared, sparked an arms race between the major powers of the world. This was, however, an arms race, which, unlike the naval arms race waged between the British Empire and the German Reich, that the Germans had a significant advantage of, having already manufactured thousands of machine guns over the course of the last few years. So much so that they were able to send 100 machine guns and teams that knew how to operate them abroad, the result of which was clear enough for everyone to see. But the more important effect of this battle was the fact that Leon Trotsky's death had made him a martyr in the eyes of the Bolsheviks and those who were sympathetic to their cause. The death of Leon Trotsky was painted as an abuse of power by the Tsar and his foreign volunteers who, according to Bolshevik propaganda, were ravenous savages who had needlessly massacred the Red Army at St. Petersburg and executed the prisoners they gained, and in doing so, accusing them of war crimes. There was only one problem with this line of thinking. Neither the Iron Brigade nor the Red Army were state actors, and because of this, they were neither protected by the conventions of the Hoagie nor obligated to abide by its rules. In fact, rules of war were generally easy to skirt around due to the specific language within them. And this was a time when the rules of war were even more loosely defined, as the Geneva Conventions, which firmly solidified the concept into international law, had yet to be established. But even under the Geneva Conventions, which limited how militaries must conduct themselves during times of war, did not provide protection to uniformed combatants. This, of course, meant the likes of terrorists, mercenaries, and foreign volunteers operating outside the scope of a nation's Department of Defense. For all intents and purposes, the Iron Brigade had no official ties to either the German military or the Russian army. Because of this, they were an organization not bound by even the strictest rules of war. And the Red Army could most certainly be defined by the term of terrorists, meaning they were not protected by the rules of war either. Hence why nobody really took the Red Army's complaints seriously, at least on the international stage. However, the Russian peasantry did indeed side with the Bolsheviks, seeing the death of 80,000 working-class Russians at the hands of foreign mercenaries brought over by the Tsar as an act of supreme oppression, one that must be stood up against. Even normal Russian men and adolescent youths who had no such notions towards socialism or communism quickly took up the hammer and sickle and declared their support by joining the Red Army. The Tsar and his family were for the time being safe in Siberia, where ample troops of the Russian army and its most loyal soldiers were stationed to protect them. And meanwhile, Bruno was meeting with the Russian military leadership in order to find a way to properly deal with the communist rebels. and doubts they may have had about the Iron Brigade quickly fell to the wayside after lifting the siege of St. Petersburg, and because of it the Russian generals and admirals were quite friendly with Bruno. Despite any past grievances they may have had for him because of his actions in China and Manchuria, or at the very least, they were respectful towards him, such as Dmitry Fyodorovich Trepov, who was the head of the Moscow police and governor-general of St. Petersburg. The man held extraordinary influence with the Tsar despite his inability to put down the Bolsheviks when they first broke out in rebellion. He was one of the Russian generals who may not personally like Bruno, but forced himself to remain polite for the sake of their temporary alliance, as well as in recognition of Bruno's accomplishments in St. Petersburg. General-Lieutenant, your reputation precedes you. One that is clearly justly earned after what you did to Leon Trotsky and his army of terrorists. Although I must say, as effective as your machine guns were in static defensive positions, I have a hard time believing they will be useful in an offensive. The Governor-General was indeed correct about that. Under normal circumstances, the Maxim-style machine guns, or any water-cooled heavy machine gun for that matter, weighed far too much to be carried into battle by a single man, or even a team of men. There was a variant which the Germans had made during the Great War to remedy this, but honestly, it was more of an ad hoc solution rather than one that was properly thought out. Instead, Bruno had a far more useful strategy in mind for how to handle this matter. One that he ironically enough hard-learned from the Red Army with the tactics they used during the Russian Civil War in his past life. Because of this, he was quick to comment on such a matter. You're not entirely wrong, General Governor. However, nor are you as forward-thinking as I am. Sure, it would be damn near impossible for a single man, or even a team of machine gunners to effectively wield such a weapon offensively. But what if you mounted it on the back of a carriage? One specifically designed to carry such a weapon and its mount. Bruno was, of course, referring to the legendary Tachanka. From Bruno's perspective, the Tachanka was an unrefined solution to a problem that was best suited to a partially industrialized society like the Russian Empire. Had this been a civil war fought in the respectable boundaries of the German Reich, he simply would have proposed the elegance and efficiency of an armored car, which had actually played a pivotal role putting down the German Revolution of 1918-1919, which was an attempt in Bruno's past life by Marxists living in the boundaries of the German Reich and the later Weimar Republic to overthrow the government and replace it with a revolutionary communist state, something that was a common occurrence throughout Europe at the time. The moment Bruno suggested this idea, the lights went off in the minds of the Russian generals. Indeed, they could mount the machine gun to the back of a carriage. That would indeed prove to be a valuable weapon for their cavalry, would it not? Because of this, Bruno did not say anything more, and would instead allow the Russians to create the Tachanka themselves, as it was not necessarily something that was difficult to make. Instead, he pointed at the map, where battle lines were being drawn, pointing towards the Volga River where the heavily industrialized city of Tsaritsyn lied. It was a city known for exceptional Marxist activity, and because of this Bruno feared it would fall into Bolshevik hands next, something that would hit the Russian Empire hard, as they relied on the industrial output from the city, which was one of few that existed in the Empire's borders. I get the feeling after suffering defeat at my hands in St. Petersburg, the Red Army will move to seize industrial centers and the means of production within them. In doing so, they will be able to cut off the Empire's domestic production of goods, something that could cripple the economy as well as supply lines. It is with this in mind, I suggest deploying a division of men to the area along with the Iron Brigade. If we can maintain authority over Tsaritsyn, then they will be able to halt the plans of the Red Army before they even begin. If we're too late, then a battle will be unavoidable. And I have the suspicion that the Red Army in the region will outnumber us significantly if such a thing were to occur. There were no arguments to be had against Bruno's statements. There was actionable intelligence collected in the region that suggests a Bolshevik takeover of the city was being planned. In addition to this, the man's logic and reasoning were sound regarding why this would occur, and the effects it would have on the Russian Empire. As a result, the Russian generals were quick to agree with Bruno's assessment, albeit debate with the man over whether or not a division of men would be enough to suffice the demands of war. Are you sure you only need a single division? We could always send more men to the area. Bruno, however, shook his head. 25,000 men, plus the 6,000 members of the Iron Brigade would suffice. After all, he had a significant advantage in firepower, which could easily overcome the human wave tactics of the Red Army. And hence, he voiced his thoughts on the matter with supreme confidence. A single division will be enough. Just make sure they aren't conscripts who barely know how to handle a rifle, and I'll be fine. With this, Bruno would begin making preparations to secure Tsaritsyn for the Tsar, something which the Red Army was also preparing to counter. Chapter 64: International Conspiracies. While Bruno was moving his forces within the Iron Brigade, as well as the supporting elements of the Imperial Russian Army, into position near the city of Tsaritsyn, international interests began to converge, not in support of the Red Army, but rather in opposition to the German Reich. To all who observed what had happened in St. Petersburg, there were two things that stood out. One, the use of machine guns as employed by the Iron Brigade had universally changed the world's understanding of warfare and how it was fought. Or at the very least, this was the case for the world's major powers. In addition to this, the use of steel helmets on the battlefield was an irregularity which the Iron Brigade had utilized. Some thought that this was perhaps simply a ceremonial decoration in reference to the word iron, which was in their unit's name. After all, most headwear in military use was ceremonial to some degree. But those with a bit more intelligence and insight were quickly able to deduce why these steel helmets were employed: to reduce head injuries from artillery, something that was rapidly becoming a concern for the world at large as artillery developed over the course of the last century. Because of this, most militaries were now looking to make investments into both machine guns and steel helmets for their soldiers. And upon seeing that the cat was now out of the bag, the German army saw this as a perfect opportunity to no longer conceal their power level, so to speak. Overnight, the preparations Bruno had made as far back as 1901 were beginning to enter the service. The new uniforms patterned after the 1915 German uniform from Bruno's past life were quickly issued to all troops. The new Feldgrau uniforms were a statement, and from the perspective of the other nations, very forward-thinking. While camouflage had yet to come into existence, gone were the days of wearing bright and flashy colors, which in all honesty was a remnant of a bygone era. Instead, the Germans had adopted a uniform in earthly tones, which would allow them to better blend in with their environment. This, of course, was another concept that other militaries began experimenting with as well. While the German Reich and its allies met together to discuss the future of warfare, including the nations of Germany, Austro-Hungary, Japan, and Italy, so too did the Reich's enemies, specifically Britain and France, as the Russian Empire was currently on the fence of whom to join. While Anglo-Russian relations were progressing as they had in Bruno's past life, it was the end of 1904, and it would be another 2 to 3 years before the Anglo-Russian Entente was signed. Bruno had chosen to throw a wrench in these plans, as he sent the Iron Brigade to ensure that Tsar's survival during the Russian Civil War, which as a result of his previous interference in the timeline had occurred a decade earlier than it should have. Thus, despite previous incidents that angered the Russian Empire, they were now no longer openly hostile with the German Reich. Instead, they were neutral in the matters of Europe. And should Bruno emerge victorious in this war, he may very well win the support of the Tsar for the German Reich. As for Italy, it was officially a part of the Triple Alliance, and had yet to default on this agreement. Because of this, they were also present at the meeting between the German Reich, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Empire of Japan, with Japan recently declaring its full-fledged support by signing its membership in the Triple Alliance, or as it was now known, the Central Powers. The gathering between Britain and France, when compared to the four nations of the Central Powers, was an immediate cause of concern for the two powers of the Entente. The German Reich had blindsided them over the course of the last 4 years. First, by signing an alliance with the Empire of Japan, and second, by revealing the advancements they had made in terms of infantry weapons and tactics. This was only a small display of what Germany actually had planned. With their semi-automatic rifles, general-purpose machine guns, submachine guns, advanced artillery, tanks, and aircraft still being either in production, undergoing military trials, or simply withheld from the public. Because of this, the representatives of Britain and France were naturally anxious. While the naval arms race was proceeding in Britain's favor, the reality of the situation was that the determining factor of the upcoming European war, as the minds of the time referred to it as, would be decided on land, not on sea. Since this appeared to be the case, the representative of the British Crown spoke with an inflection in his tone that hinted the nervousness of only himself, but also the monarch he served as he met with the French president in Paris. Of course, King Edward and Parliament as a whole would like to assure our allies in France that we are wholeheartedly dedicated to the agreements which we signed earlier this year. However, there are certain matters for concern. It was bad enough when our enemies appeared to be the three realms of Germany, Austria, and Italy. But now the Japanese have thrown their lot in with the Triple Alliance, meaning our possessions in the East will no doubt come under attack should war emerge between us all. In addition to this, relations with the Russian Empire appear to be heading in the opposite direction. The League of Three Emperors that fell apart in decades past due to conflicting interests between Austria and Russia may very well be reformed, especially after the recent deployment of the Iron Brigade to Russia and their victory at St. Petersburg. This incident appears to have mended the strained relations between the German Reich and the Russian Empire. I fear that should this young German general play a more significant role in the conflict, the Tsar might very well be swayed to join our rivals. Albeit there would need to be some significant diplomatic maneuvering on behalf of the German leadership should they wish to achieve such a goal. Even so, if such a thing were allowed to come to pass, then we would most certainly find ourselves isolated from the rest of the world's major powers. As mighty as the British Empire is, such a combined force could easily overwhelm our two nations in an armed conflict, especially after Germany has revealed its hand. Investing heavily into machine guns was a strategy that none of us could have anticipated, and perhaps if this was a year ago, I would mock the Germans for such a strategy. But St. Petersburg proved beyond a reasonable doubt the overwhelming effectiveness of such weapons. So much so that as we speak, our army is scrambling in its efforts to procure as many machine guns as possible. However, I fear we are quite a bit behind our rivals, and this gap only seems to be increasing in scale. If we wish to win this war, then we must find a way to tarnish the relations between the German Reich and the Russian Empire. We must also act swiftly to convince Italy to join our side. If forced to fight a three-front war, the odds will be significantly much more in our favor. But if the German Reich and its allies coordinated their efforts entirely on your borders, there is no army in this world that could save you, my friend. Perhaps it was simply the nature of the French, on some deeply ingrained genetic level. But the French president had a smug and arrogant air about him. Even under such pressure from the other major powers, he seemed almost entirely unconcerned, as if France was somehow superior to everyone else in this world, so much so that they could take on the entire world by themselves and emerge victorious. And it was hence no surprise when his response exuded such a conceited aura. I thank you for your concerns, Ambassador, and your proposals are indeed interesting to say the least. However, there is one clear defining factor in the creation of these so-called Central Powers, and that is this fool who calls himself the Wolf of Prussia. He alone has gained the favor of the Japanese and continued to coerce the Russians to his side. The solution to this problem is incredibly simple. Slay the wolf, and the alliances he has made will fall apart. Because of this, the Republic will do everything we can to arm and supply the Red Army in secret. After all, we do not wish to strain relations with the Tsar. Then again, should the Red Army emerge victorious, they would be a far more valuable ally, as they will not suffer from the incompetency of the Tsar, nor will they share any ideological ties to these Central Powers. As for the young general in question, our agents are being dispatched to Russia to take care of him. I promise you this, he will not live to see the end of this war. These words were not reassuring for the British ambassador. For starters, neither he nor the British government in favor of empowering radical revolutionaries of any ideology, especially those that despised monarchies and republics alike. In addition to this, he believed that the French had missed the point entirely, focusing on one man rather than the alliances he had helped establish. It was an error in thinking, one that could only be explained by the hatred which the French had for their neighbors to the east. The reality of the situation was, these concerns were largely unfounded. It would be difficult for Austria and Russia to resolve their disputes in the Balkans. One of the other would have to concede, and that was simply improbable. As for Italy, they were a wild card. And Bruno personally had more faith in being able to wipe out the Italian army in its entirety at Isonzo than he did in them actually maintaining their loyalty to their allies. 2 world wars in his past life had proven Italians to be both ineffective on the battlefield and untrustworthy as allies. Because of this, Bruno would rather have the Italians as an enemy than be stabbed in the back by them, and he would naturally advise the Kaiser on this position when the time came for him to do so. Chapter 65. Assassination in the Streets of St. Petersburg. Bruno didn't realize it, but the French had sent agents to Russia for the specific purpose of assassinating him. Instead, he was in the middle of readying his forces for the march on Tsaritsyn. It wasn't exactly something that could reasonably be handled overnight. Establishing a logistical network took time, and considering the vast territory of Russia and the largely barren wasteland that it was, creating this supply line was an effort of monumental undertaking. The worst thing you could possibly do as a commander is to become overeager in the pursuit of victory, and in doing so advance beyond your supply lines. It was a mistake that many nations had made in history, and nearly every time it ended in complete and total disaster. And many of these instances had taken place in Russia itself, whether it was Napoleon's march on Moscow or Germany's assault on Stalingrad. Both ended in defeat, and the consequences of which ultimately lost them the war. Had Germany maintained its supply lines WW2, they wouldn't have run out of critical resources such as cold weather clothing, ammunition, and most important of all, fuel. Because of these shortages, the German army was horrifically defeated at Stalingrad, thus breaking the German advance into Russia and starting a whole new stage of the war that led the Red Army to Berlin in the end. Bruno naturally would not make this mistake. Sure, he was fighting on behalf of the Tsar, rather than being a foreign invader, and hence could rely on the Russian railways to support his campaign to take Tsaritsyn. But Russia was woefully underdeveloped, so much so that a lot of his time would be spent marching across open plains in the dead of winter. There was the option to wait until spring to begin his offensive. However, this itself would ensure that Tsaritsyn fell into the Red Army's hands, and in doing so, give them time to prepare for the assault, the result of which would no doubt incur heavy casualties to the Tsarist forces and the Iron Brigade. Attrition was a natural part of war, and in a way was natural selection itself. Those who died on the march to Tsaritsyn would be left to freeze and become one with the earth itself. Bruno simply did not have time under such constraints to prepare proper burials. And it was because of these constraints both in time and resources that Bruno was frantically walking across St. Petersburg, where the bulk of his forces were gathered, marching in and out of offices of various military departments and political figures, trying his best to get things in order before the long march began. It was perhaps because he was walking so erratically through the streets and with much on his mind that Bruno did not notice he was being followed. Normally, Bruno's paranoia would keep his head on a swivel, but with so much to prepare for, and so little time to do it in, his mind was not focused on his surroundings, but rather how he would complete his objectives before the time to march began. Eventually, after crossing a corner, Bruno came across a man blocking his path. The man was dressed by a local, but his facial features gave him away as a native to Western Europe. Bruno was about to question just who this man was when he realized a revolver was pointing at his chest. The man simply pointed the weapon at Bruno's chest and fired, the shot clearly piercing into his chest as Bruno stood there in shock. Several of the guards chased after the would-be assassin immediately after he fired the shot, causing him to be unable to continue with his efforts, while others attended to Bruno, who appeared almost entirely unfazed after being hit in the chest with a bullet. Instead, he felt around his own chest with his bare fingers. No doubt there was something wet rapidly spreading across his chest. But luckily for Bruno, when he pulled his fingers out from under his clothes, this liquid was not blood, but rather the vodka in his flask, which had taken the bullet for him. After all, revolver cartridges of the era were incredibly anemic, especially in Europe. Bruno, of course, recognized the pistol that had been used to shoot him. It was a French revolver. He had, after all, seen them during his time in China. Specifically, it was the French Modely 1873 revolver, a sidearm which fired the 11mm French ordnance round. And while this might sound like a big and powerful cartridge to the uninitiated, the reality was that it had roughly the equivalent velocity and stopping power of a .25 ACP. To put this in perspective, the .25 ACP cartridge in the 21st century was considered inadequate for personal defense. So much so that a study found that of 68 people shot with the cartridge, 35% of them were not even incapacitated, and only 25% of them were fatal injuries. Meanwhile, the cartridge used to assassinate Bruno, which was roughly the equivalent of the .25 ACP, was even weaker, gaining a similar performance of the .25 ACP fired out of a 2-inch barrel pocket pistol, while being fired from a full-sized revolver. In other words, the steel flask which Bruno carried in his breast pocket, when combined with his thick wool winter jacket, had quite literally saved his life. The fact that Bruno was still standing after being literally shot in the chest meant he was incredibly pissed off at whoever had tried to kill him. Because of this, Bruno quite literally pulled out his own pistol, which fired the Superior 9x19mm Luger, a pistol cartridge still used on modern battlefields, in self-defense by the time Bruno had died in his past life. When he rounded the corner, Bruno found the man disarmed and being held at gunpoint by his guards, who pointed their rifles at his face. Bruno, of course, approached the man, holstering his pistol as he did so, before getting up in his would-be assassin's face. There was a fearsome expression on Bruno's face, so much so that the man who had just tried to kill him was terrified. Yet that did not stop Bruno from behaving with violence. He immediately punched the man in the face, while grabbing the back of his head with both hands, where he deliberately kneed him would-be assassin in the testicles 3 times. Once the man was throwing up the contents of his stomach while on his knees, Bruno ruthlessly kicked him in the head with a vicious soccer kick, which the steel toe of his boot immediately collided with the assassin's skull, knocking him out on the spot, where Bruno proceeded to stomp on his unconscious face. He was just about to kill his assassin, all the while screaming obscenities at the man the entire time. "You stupid motherfucker. You actually fucking dare? I'll fucking rip your intestines out and hang you with them, you piece of fucking shit." Ultimately, as the man lay on the brink of the death, Bruno's guards pulled him away. Any further violence would end the man's life before he could be properly interrogated. And that was something which Bruno's soldiers, who were not nearly as enraged as their commander was, would not allow to happen. Thus, 2 of the men pulled Bruno aside and calmed him down, while the other 2 lifted the unconscious assassin up, as they dragged him off to be transported to the hospital for treatment, just enough that the man was stable. After all, he would be transported back to the Reich for interrogation, which would be a gruesome process in and of itself. As for Bruno, despite his best efforts to assure the men he was okay, the bullet had pierced slightly into his flesh. It was a flesh wound, nothing serious, but the men beneath his command still insisted he get medical treatment. And because of this, Bruno was also evacuated to the German Reich for medical treatment. For 2 reasons. 1, the medical industry in Germany was much better than in Russia at the moment. And 2, Bruno was a man of supreme importance to the German Reich. Thus, when the Kaiser learned of this attack on the man, he overreacted to it. Thus, Bruno was ultimately sidelined for some time in regards to marching on Tsaritsyn. The attack on his life had ensured the Red Army's takeover of the industrial city, and Bruno would instead have to march in the spring, something that, while favorable to the soldiers during the march, would inevitably result in higher casualties when the bullets started flying. As for who was behind the attack, whether it was the Red Army or one of the German Reich's adversaries on the global stage, this would be revealed soon enough. Chapter 66. Hell Hath No Fury. Word quickly reached the fatherland of the assassination of the attempt on Bruno's life while in the streets of St. Petersburg. While Russia was currently in a civil war, St. Petersburg was considered a stronghold of the Tsar and his loyalists, especially after the siege it endured in the past few months. After all, anyone even remotely suspected of having loyalty to the Bolsheviks, or even sympathy for that matter, had been dragged from their homes and shot in the streets. Because of this, it was considered relatively safe, or at least as safe as an area could be in a country currently embroiled in a civil war. Still, in the middle of broad daylight, a man had shot the leader of the Iron Brigade in a botched assassination attempt, and this had generated many headlines. Luckily for Bruno, a habit of his that was utterly detrimental to his health had ironically saved his life. Bruno was, after all, a man who relied heavily on substance abuse to cope with his increasing PTSD. and it was because of this that he kept a pack of cigarettes and a flask of hard liquor on him at all times. This steel flask had taken the primary impact of the bullet, allowing it to just barely penetrate his flesh at a depth that was not lethal. He had survived the attack on his life, and rumor had it the man had chased down his assailant and beat him half to death after having quite literally just been shot in the chest. The reality of the situation was that the would-be assassin was already caught by Bruno's guards when the man vented his rage upon him. But soldiers had a way of exaggerating things, and the tale which the soldiers spun was quickly over time morphed into something more myth than reality. Even so, the Wolf of Prussia had gained a reputation for being both impervious to bullets and ruthless in retaliation. Of course, the would-be assassin, after being discharged from the hospital, was transferred into the care of the German Army's Foreign Intelligence Division, who did a number on the man in order to get the truth to him. The man tried his best to bite his tongue, but ultimately he gave up everything he had on his masters and their plans to eliminate Bruno from the chessboard. Naturally, when the Kaiser learned that the French had dared to try to assassinate one of his generals, he was pissed. He had, after all, invested a significant sum of resources into Bruno's development as a general. But the Kaiser's fury paled in comparison to that of Bruno's wife. Heidi was quickly alerted to what had happened, and when she did, she kept in contact with her cousin who worked at the German Army's Foreign Intelligence Division. The man kept her up to date on all the latest information gained from their victim. And in the end, after he had divulged everything he knew, Heidi's reaction would have been terrifying had anyone witnessed it. The normally timid and submissive housewife had a haunting expression on her otherwise flawless face, one that conveyed an urge to personally flay the flesh from the bones of the man who had dared to try to take her husband away from her and her young children. But she did not immediately respond to the words spoken by her cousin, who was on the other end of the line, remaining silent for a long time, long enough to provoke a response from the man she was speaking to. "Heidi, are you all right?" Heidi finally snapped back to reality as she asked a question to the man, and in a way that deeply unnerved him. "Hey, you once said that you would do anything I ask, right? After what I did for your sister, you said you owe me in more ways than I could possibly imagine, right?" Despite having previously said these words, and with full intent behind them, Heidi's cousin couldn't help but feel something dreadful coming from the woman on the other end of the line. And it was perhaps because of this that his tone was filled with anxiety as he responded to her questions. "Yeah, of course. So long as it is in my power, I will help you with whatever you desire. What exactly are you thinking, Heidi? Isn't your husband resting in the other room after being injured? You should go tend to him rather than ask whatever it is you are about to ask." Heidi, of course, didn't hear what the man had said. She was in a murderous trance, and because of this the words she spoke were filled with such hostility. Promise me that this man who dared to attack my husband, promise me that his death will be slow and painful. I want him to suffer hell itself before you send him to where he belongs." Heidi did not wait for a response, and instead hung up on her cousin, immediately shifting back to her normal loving and cheerful self as she rushed into the other room to tend to Bruno, who was lying in bed taking it easy after the doctors told him he was not going back to St. Petersburg until after his wounds healed. This was the Kaiser's orders, after all, and because of this, Bruno had no choice but to leave the Iron Brigade's affairs in the command of the officer ranked directly beneath him. Bruno wasn't seriously injured, at least not enough to actually be bedridden, but for whatever reason those around him were treating him as such, with Heidi coming in to change his bandage and disinfect his wound with alcohol. Not that it really needed such treatment. "Are you feeling all right? Do you want something for the pain? I can fetch you some alcohol, or perhaps some opium, if you really need it." Bruno scoffed. Pain. The bullet had penetrated less than an inch into his flesh. Hell, when the doctor pulled it out of him, it was the bottom of it was quite literally visibly poking out of his flesh. It was a minor injury, one barely worth mentioning. Why was everyone acting as if he was terminally fucking ill? Bruno, of course, had no idea that Heidi had just ensured his would-be assassin's death would be as slow and painful of a process as possible. Not that the sadistic psychopaths who worked as interrogators for the German Reich would really mind the extra effort. It was an era before torturing prisoners for information was considered immoral, unethical, or illegal. Because of this, a very special breed of nut job usually ended up employed in such a profession. and they would enjoy every moment of it. Still, Bruno didn't want to express how he was annoyed with the way his wife was babying him, and thus forced a smile as he shook his head, assuring her he was all right. Heidi, I'm fine, honestly. I don't know why you are all overreacting. This wouldn't be the first time I nearly lost my life. Bruno was just about to say this wouldn't be the first time he died, but caught himself midway through. I mean, compared to actually dying in his past life, a near-death experience was nothing all that traumatic. Of course, this was not exactly a response Heidi was looking for either, her mood immediately becoming dark as she interrogated the man on when else he nearly lost his life. What? When? Where? Was it those yellow fucking bastards? Did they nearly get you killed in Manchuria? Don't worry, honey. I'll make sure they pay for their sins. Bruno had never seen such a crazed side of his wife before. She had never actually used profanity in front of the man before. And because of this, he was taken aback as he grabbed hold of her hands and brought her back to a state of normalcy. I'm being hyperbolic here, Heidi. Relax, okay? Everything is fine. I'm fine. You don't need to worry so much. Heidi once more returned to her usual self as she clung to Bruno and held him tightly, saying things to him that were not necessarily reassuring to the man. I'm sorry, honey. I overreacted just now. It's just after everything that has happened. After your injury, I've been worrying about what would happen if I lost you. If the kids lost you. I don't know how I would go on without you. Bruno ultimately decided to treat this statement as if it was one of affection and not something he should be worried about. Because of this, he pet the woman's golden hair and comforted her. No doubt she was shaken up after what happened to him, and until now, he had done a poor job at easing her anxiety. Because of this, Bruno would spend much of the day in bed cuddling with his wife. Chapter 67. God, Family, Kaiser, and Fatherland. Bruno's recovery was rather swift. And why wouldn't it be? The bullet had barely lodged itself in his flesh. The projectile was extracted, a stitch or two was applied, followed by some bandages, which were tenderly replaced in a timely manner by Bruno's wife. Sure, he had damn near died, and would have done so if he wasn't an alcoholic, but the wound itself which had been inflicted on him was minor. The near-death incident came from the fact that had he not been wearing a thick and heavy wool greatcoat with a steel flask in his breast pocket, then the bullet most definitely would have pierced his heart and killed him. Because of how Heidi reacted in an overly protective and almost motherly way, Bruno was quite literally forced to rest in bed by the woman and to be tended to by her as if he were a sick child. While this had some appeal in its own right, Bruno honestly believed his beloved wife was overreacting. If there was one upside to the attempt on his life, at least from the perspective of those who had initiated the failed attack, then it was the fact that the winter offensive, which Bruno had planned in the Volga region in a maneuver to root out and destroy the Red Army and their supporters in the region, had been effectively postponed until spring. This gave the Red Army time to properly prepare for the Tsarist forces and their assault. Frankly, Bruno had wanted to prevent this from happening, even if it meant marching on Tsaritsyn in the winter. A mistake the German army had made during the Second World War of his past life that had in many ways cost them the entire war. After all, the Soviet Union had renamed many historical Russian cities after the leaders of the Socialist Revolution. For example, St. Petersburg became Leningrad, while Tsaritsyn became Stalingrad. Hence why Bruno was overly cautious with the preparations of his supply lines in order to sustain his assault on the city and the Bolsheviks within it. Bruno was, after all, not the type of man to make the same mistakes as others before him. In fact, he had a tendency to learn from said mistakes and avoid them altogether. It was a rare quality in a man. After all, most people tended to repeat the same mistakes as their forebearers, even if they were warned in advance not to do so. Perhaps it was the intrinsic arrogance of mankind, but such was the way of life for many human beings. However, Bruno was not cut from the same cloth as these lesser men, and because of this he had made ample preparations for the winter offensive to ensure his soldiers had the clothing, rations, medical supplies, weapons, and munitions needed to capture not only Tsaritsyn, but the entire Volga region. Of course, with the attempt on his life and the injuries sustained during this, these plans had utterly gone to waste. Because of this, Bruno had much time in the day to make other preparations for a far more distant future. Currently, He was lying in his bed thinking about the natural consequences that would result from the deployment of the Iron Brigade in Russia, and what he had given to the Tsar to deal with the Red Army more efficiently. The Tachanka was a valuable weapon in an era lacking in armored warfare. But Bruno already had a sufficient answer to deal with them. The powertrain used on his modified E-10 tank was largely modeled after the one used on the Panzer V Panther medium tank in his past life. It was capable of producing 690 HP or 515 kWs. But the Panther tank weighed 44.8 tons, while the E-10 series tanks weighed a maximum of 25 tons. Or as Bruno called it in this life, the Panzer I, with his specific model weighing roughly 20 tons in total, which was less than half that of the Panther medium tank. This meant that the overall power-to-weight ratio was much more favorable when it came to speed and maneuverability. Hence, while the Tachanka had a maximum speed of roughly 12 miles per hour or roughly 19 kilometers per hour. However, the German Panzer in this life could easily triple that speed, as the Panther tank was more than capable of doing so itself. Realistically, the max speed of the Panzer I in this life could potentially be as much as 5x the speed of the Tachanka, if not more. Not only that, but the Tachanka was only equipped with a Maxim heavy machine gun, which, when the Russians adopted their own variant, would fire the 7.62x 54 RMM cartridge. In other words, a .30 caliber cartridge. Meanwhile, the Panzer I was equipped with a 5 cm main gun on its turret, along with a coaxially mounted 8mm machine gun. This meant that the Panzer I in this life, which was modeled after the E-10 prototype light tank in Bruno's past life, was not only capable of outrunning the Tachankas that they may fight on the Eastern Front in the upcoming Great War, but could also obliterate them with a single shot fired from its main gun. In other words, Bruno had no fear leaking the effectiveness of machine guns, or even the Tachanka, as these things would either already be discovered at the start of the Great War, or were simply incapable of really dealing with what Bruno had already made preparations for. It was while Bruno was contemplating on these matters that his 3 children ran up to him. At the moment, Bruno was resting in his bed, as even getting out of it for more than just a bathroom break, or to take a shower, was enough to spur the wrath of his wife. The kids had obviously been worried the moment their father returned home early. They were not alerted to the fact that someone had tried to take their father's life. But they weren't stupid. Obviously, by the way, their mother was babying the man, and the fact that he lied in bed all day. He was either injured or sick. And because of this, Bruno's 2 daughters and his only son ran up to him and jumped into his bed, checking on their old man to see if he was all right. With Eva being the oldest, she had a better mastery of the German language and was thus more capable of asking her father what was wrong. Is Daddy hurt? Or just sick? Bruno, who did not want to worry his children over what had happened or his minor injury, was quick to drag the girls into both of his arms, while assuring them that everything was all right. I'm fine. I'm just a little under the weather is all. And on top of that, I was a little homesick. So I decided to take a break from my trip overseas to come see your mother and the lot of you. You all don't have to worry. I'll be fine in a few weeks. But I'm afraid once I am feeling better, I will have to leave all of you once more. Bruno naturally didn't want to get his children's hopes up or give them the idea that he would be staying with them for very long. That would be cruel to them, and that was the last thing he wanted his father. Because of this, Bruno made his kids aware of the reality of the situation, without revealing unnecessary matters that would only haunt them, and perhaps cause some childhood trauma, something that Bruno wanted to avoid as long as possible. As if Heidi had a sixth sense about Bruno's well-being, she instantly burst into the room wielding a wooden spoon that appeared to be coated partially in the food, which she was no doubt preparing prior to this moment. There was a stern look on the woman's face as she gazed upon her children, who had so brazenly jumped on top of their father, and was quick to reprimand them. Be careful with your father. He has been through a lot, and you jumping on top of him like a bunch of little hooligans is not going to help. The kids instantly bolted from the room, running past their mother as if they were doing so in fear for their lives. Not out of any seriousness, as they were clearly laughing as they did so, cracking jokes at their mother's overbearing personality. Run away. Mommy is mad. Mommy is going to get you. Wait, don't leave me behind. Once the kids had all disappeared around the corner, even Bruno broke out laughing, which only caused Heidi to pout as she averted her gaze from her husband and crossed her arms. Honestly, you spoil them too much. For a brief moment, Bruno's wife and kids had made him completely forget about his worries, filling him with nothing but a sense of worth. It also acted as a reminder of what he was fighting for. Not only did he want to ensure that the evils of Marxism never spread across the world, but he was also fighting to preserve the traditional way of life that he found himself enjoying at the moment. Bruno fought not only to rid the world of the evil that was Marxism, but also for the sake of God, family, Kaiser, and fatherland. That's right, he was now fighting for God along with the other three most important things in his life. In his previous life, Bruno had been an atheist, or at the very least agnostic. He was the type of man to curse God, and frequently at that, for a world which had gone very wrong. Even in this new lease on life, he had stubbornly refused to accept religion as a major part of it. But as he sat here in bed, after surviving an assassination attempt that would have killed him in any other circumstance while surrounded by a loving family, which had been a luxury he had been denied in his previous life, Bruno found himself pondering about whether or not what had just happened to him was a part of God's will. Had God brought Bruno back in time to correct the mistakes of the past that had resulted in what was clearly a doomed timeline? I mean, how else would you explain his reincarnation and his survival in an attempt on his life that should have left him dead in the Russian snow? Bruno no longer merely shouted the words, "God with us," as nothing more than a mere battle cry of his people's culture and history. No, he genuinely believed God was with him, that he was acting in accordance with God's will, and that God desired the very thing he desired. This newfound sense of faith had become yet another reason for Bruno to pursue military excellence in this life, even if it cost him the sanity of his mind. Such was a worthy sacrifice to ensure that the world did not degenerate into the state it had been in when he had perished during the final days of his last life. Soon enough, Bruno would be back on his feet, taking the first boat back to St. Petersburg, where he would rally with the Iron Brigade and the loyalists who fought for the Tsar. Then they would begin their spring offensive, and in doing so, annihilate the Red Army and its supporters in the Volga region. Chapter 68, Propaganda. To say that the Red Army had doubled in size since the death of Leon Trotsky and the 80,000 men beneath his command at St. Petersburg was an understatement. The new year had begun, and with it the winter was slowly starting to die out. Ample preparations had been made after the citizens of Tsaritsyn had revolted, seizing control of the means of production and using them to enhance their military capabilities. They knew it was only a matter of time until the Tsar's forces launched a full-scale offensive against them. And currently, Tsaritsyn was defended by 100,000 members of the Red Army, which, though they did not know it yet, would be 4x larger than the forces sent to take the city back from them. Trotsky's death was not the serious blow to the Bolshevik movement that Bruno thought it would be. At the end of the day, such an insidious and destructive ideology was harder to stamp out than a colony of roaches. His death had earned him the fabled status of martyrdom, not in some brave and heroic display of one's faith in God, but rather in the most absurd and wicked kind. His cowardly death after sending 80,000 men to meet the devil to whom they owed their souls was not how the Bolshevik leaders depicted Trotsky. It wasn't exactly a noble and chivalric image to inspire the masses, after all. No, the Bolsheviks did what they did best: lie, subvert, and manipulate. They painted Trotsky as a heroic defender of the masses, one fighting against a tyrannical monarch, a despotic aristocracy, and of course the savage presence of foreign mercenaries. Never mind the fact that it was Trotsky who had besieged the peaceful city of St. Petersburg, and in doing so, shelled the city and the innocent civilians within it without any regard to civilian casualties. Nor did they reveal the truth that the Tsarist officers stood in the trenches defending the city from the Red Army's multiple attacks, whereas the Bolshevik officers hid in the relative safety of their fortifications while sending the men beneath their command to their deaths. No, such truths would not exactly inspire any man to pick up a rifle and fight for the spineless Bolshevik leaders who were the true despots and tyrants. Of course, when Bruno returned to St. Petersburg and learned of such slanderous recruitment tactics, he devised a sinister propaganda campaign of his own. The heritage of the Bolshevik leadership was quickly uncovered, as were their more atheistic tendencies and their affluent backgrounds. It was not exactly a secret, or at least not in Bruno's past life, that the overwhelming majority of Marxist revolutionary leaders throughout Europe were not what they preached to be. Whether in Russia or Germany, the leaders of the Marxist uprisings tended to have three things in common. They were primarily, if not exclusively, of Jewish heritage. They were atheistic to the point of being outright anti-religious, especially anti-Christian, and they came from prominent backgrounds. Considering this was an era where Christianity, nationalism, and anti-Semitism were the norm in nearly all European societies. It was no wonder that the Tsar used this information to paint the loyalist army as defenders of God and motherland, while simultaneously depicting their Bolshevik rivals as a bunch of atheistic Jews, not of the working class like they claimed to represent, but rather from prominent and affluent families. Families who had gained their wealthy through the biblical sin of usury. It was sort of a game of know you, where the Tsar blamed the miserable living conditions of the Russian working class on the Marxist leaders whose families had bled the people dry with the sinful practice of usury rather than their own excessive taxation, embezzlement, and just general incompetency. And this counter-propaganda quickly revealed its results as recruitment for the Russian army reached new heights. Especially after the victory at St. Petersburg was depicted as a gift to the Russian people by God. Not only that, but the failed assassination attempt on Bruno's life, for propaganda purposes, was made out to be an attack by the Red Army. Though Germany knew the truth that it was the French who had done so, and was preparing in the background for a proper retaliation, they did not inform this matter to the Russians, as Bruno suggested it would be better to paint his survival as a miracle bestowed by God, so that he could lead the Russian people over the devil's spawn known as the Red Army. There was no mention that Bruno's flask had saved his life. Rather, in all forms of Russian propaganda, it was God's will and his light that saved Bruno, turning the ultra-Orthodox portion of the population into men willing to follow this foreign general chosen by God to protect the Russian people from their enemies. Propaganda was a powerful tool, and it was unfortunate for the Bolshevik leadership that Bruno knew everything about their lives, which he could use to paint them as the enemy of all humanity. Even if some of the things he used were distorted or blatant slander, all their attempts to hide these things only further added to whatever the Tsarist propaganda said about them. It was perhaps because of this that the leaders of the revolution were meeting underground in Moscow to discuss what was happening. Though it was now common belief that they had ordered the hit on Bruno, these men knew this wasn't the case. Even so, Vladimir Lenin was quick to ask his comrades if this was truly the case. "I'm only going to ask this once, so if any of you are hiding something from me, now would be the time to reveal it." Though Bruno von Zehntner shot our comrade in the streets like a feral dog, any attempt to assassinate him would be incredibly unwise. So, if any of you had anything to do with the attempt on the man's life, now would be the time to confess. Because the Tsar is using this to rally the support of the Christian population towards his cause. Sure, our recruitment has gone up, but the most recent series of anti-Bolshevik propaganda has caused uncertainty in the ranks of our followers, and has even caused several members of the Red Army to desert. Obviously, nobody in the room knew who had ordered the hit on Bruno, nor were they willing to take responsibility for something they had no control over. It was perhaps because of this that Litvinov was quick to voice his opposition to Lenin's sudden temper tantrum. With all due respect, comrade, none of us here knows who is responsible for this sudden assassination or why. It could very well have been an attack proposed by members of the Tsar's own inner circle who still hold a grudge against them and for what he did in China and Manchuria. It's not like his victory in St. Petersburg has washed away the hatred that many in the Russian military have for him. And if anything, this new propaganda depicting the man as God's chosen leader for the Russian army has further exacerbated this sentiment among those who still hate the man. It would not be all that surprising if another such attempt happened. While this was true to some extent, many of those who held a grudge against Bruno for his previous actions against the Russian Empire were restraining themselves, either by order of the Tsar himself, or simply because after St. Petersburg they realized how significant the support of the Iron Brigade, and by extension the Kaiser, who was backing them, really was. Because of this, there would be no move by the Tsar or his loyalists against Bruno anytime soon. Nor would the Bolsheviks be aware of this, or the fact that the men responsible for the attempt on Bruno's life were actually the French. Hence why Litvinov tried to focus the attention of the Bolshevik leaders, especially Lenin, away from what had already happened, and instead on how they could fix their current problems. Anyway, the point is we should not focus on who is responsible for this attack and the effects it has had on our movement, but rather on how to remedy this situation. What we need to do is convince the people that we are not anti-Christian, anti-Russian, or somehow responsible for the woes of the common man. Utter silence prevailed for some time after Litvinov said this, not because the Bolshevik leaders were brainstorming, but rather because they were all thinking of the same thing. Which one of them had the nerve to say aloud? But aren't all those things true? The moment the man said this, all of his comrades glared daggers at him, causing him to backtrack to some extent. I mean, to some extent. Obviously, the Tsar is using this as an opportunity to slander us. Sometimes it was better not to say what everyone was thinking aloud, and this was most certainly one of those cases. As for the man who had given voice to these suppressed sentiments, he would come to regret it very much, and he would be chosen to repent for doing so by leading the defense of Tsaritsyn against the Tsarist forces and the accompanying Iron Brigade. Chapter 69. The Spring Offensive begins. Rather surprisingly, after the attempt on Bruno's life, and the propaganda used to depict it as an attack by the Red Army, it was not just the Russian army's forces who were bolstered by mass recruitment. When the news reached the shores of the German Reich, tens of thousands of men were up in arms, declaring their intention to join the Iron Brigade and put an end to the Bolsheviks once and for all. There were chants for war in the streets of Berlin, as veterans and civilians alike demanded the blood of the Marxists who had dared to do something as cowardly as attack their general in the streets of St. Petersburg. Naturally, the outcry for war and the tens of thousands of men who rallied in support of it had the French sweating bullets, as they realized they were incredibly lucky that their attack was mistaken for one conducted by the Red Army. This, however, was far from the truth. The German government knew all too well the French were behind the assassination attempt, and were preparing for a swift and brutal retaliation against French military leadership themselves. But for the time being, they allowed the people of the world to believe the masterminds behind this attack were the Bolsheviks, as it furthered the current goals of the German Reich, which was to bring an end to the ongoing Russian Civil War. As a result, the Iron Brigade began accepting more and more members, causing the German arms industry to begin the manufacture of more weapons to support the number of foreign volunteers participating in the Russian Civil War. Machine guns, artillery, rifles, and grenades were manufactured to meet the demand, while the Iron Brigade established proper training centers where one could learn to march, shoot, as well as perform basic infantry tactics. Whether this meant urban warfare training, trench warfare training, basic combat medical training, or the use and operation of heavy weaponry such as machine guns and artillery. Over the course of the months following Bruno's injury, an additional 19,000 men were armed, trained, and sent to St. Petersburg to fight as a part of the Iron Brigade. Of these 25,000 men, 15,000 operated as infantry, and 4,000 were trained for use in artillery regiments, meaning that with Bruno's current 5,000 infantry and 1,000 artillery, the Iron Brigade now had an entire division composed of 4 infantry brigades and 1 entire brigade's worth of artillery, thus changing the name of the volunteer unit from the Iron Brigade to the Iron Division. This was not exactly within Bruno's expectations, but as a result, he happily accepted the volunteers from the fatherland into his ranks, bolstering the forces who planned to attack the Red Army at Tsaritsyn by 19,000 men, 400 machine guns, and 144 field artillery pieces, bringing the combined total number of the Iron Brigade to 25,000 men, 500 machine guns, and 180 75mm field guns. Bruno also could have easily added mortars to the division, but that would have been overkill and exposed a valuable secret to the world. Because of this, he elected to simply use these weapons, which would be more than enough to annihilate the Red Army in its entirety, let alone the 100,000 men defending Tsaritsyn. This was also combined with the division from Russia, which was composed of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. As a result, Bruno would be marching on Tsaritsyn with 50,000 men in total, which, though half the amount of the enemy, had significant advantages over the Red Army, who would be defending the city which they now occupied. After spending the remainder of the winter ensuring everything was in place to transport these 50,000 men to the Volga region, Bruno gave the order to march. Trains would transport the majority of the men and their equipment to the nearest Tsarist-occupied rail station to the city of Tsaritsyn, where the rest of the men would march from there. Because of the established railways, it made the journey much smoother. As Bruno sat silently in his own secured car while watching the Russian countryside pass him by, it would have been a rather comforting journey if the end destination wasn't a battlefield, one taking place in a city that was bound to be laid to waste by the campaign. But Bruno had long since learned to enjoy the simple things in life while he could, and peaceful moments such as this. Because of this, he simply smoked in silence and enjoyed the view. A view he hoped he would never have to gaze upon again. Because Bruno knew if he did so, it meant that he would be back in this part of Russia for the same purpose he was now: war. And that was something which he, for obvious reasons, found to be undesirable. Of course, he also knew that it was damn near unavoidable. In 10 years' time, he would see this exact landscape. Assuming the Tsar and his army didn't croak by the time he made it to Tsaritsyn. Because of that, Bruno was curious about how the area would change by then, if it even would at all. At the end of the day, nothing stayed the same forever. Such was a sentiment on Bruno's mind as the train finally made it to the last stop, where he stepped out of the car, put on his greatcoat and load-bearing equipment, and attached his helmet as he walked into the Russian countryside during the start of spring. Plumes of smoke blew in the distance, no doubt from the factories that at this moment were being used to manufacture weapons and munitions for the Red Army. Weapons and munitions that would soon be used against Bruno and his men. But that was not a concern for Bruno. Instead, he waited for the remainder of his army to arrive, which would no doubt take a considerable amount of time. Because of this, Bruno decided to take up temporary residence at the local inn. As the commander of this army, he was after all expected to arrive before the rest of his men. Or such was the mentality which Bruno followed. He would be the first to arrive to every battlefield which he made his mark upon, and the last to leave its desolated grounds. Or such were the ideals which he aspired to. Practicality often got in the way of such lofty determination. For example, if God forbid the enemy managed to overrun him and his army, as a general whose importance to the war was far greater than the average soldier, Bruno would have no choice but to evacuate at the first given opportunity. The Bolshevik commander chosen to lead the Red Army at Tsaritsyn was none other than a young Yakov Sverdlov. Yakov was a Bolshevik revolutionary and leader who had been given command of the Red Army at Tsaritsyn after Leon Trotsk's death at the hands of Bruno. He was several years younger than Bruno, currently at the age of 25, and was archetypical for the Tsarist anti-communist propaganda, insofar as he was from a Jewish family of some prominence, with his father being an engraver who forged documents for the Bolsheviks. He was also an atheist and anti-religious, thus only adding to the fuel which the Tsarist propaganda machine used to combat the Bolshevik Revolution. Of his 6 siblings, 5 of them were involved in the revolution to some capacity, with their parents also playing a part. Quite frankly, Bruno would just assume the 6 siblings were guilty and have them all hanged at the end of the war if they managed to survive until then. The young man had no real military training. But because of his family's prominence in the Bolshevik movement, and because he had spoken out of turn, he was given the task of dealing with the Wolf of Prussia and his march on Tsaritsyn. The man gazed in the distance from the safety of Tsaritsyn and watched as the weeks went by, and the enemy army began to build their fortifications outside the city. An elaborate trench system was dug around Tsaritsyn, where field guns of varying size and capability were placed within them. In addition to this, the Tsarist trenches were filled with hundreds of machine guns, only furthering the notion that the German Reich had spent years amassing such weapons. It was unknown just how many machine guns were currently in the German army, but judging by the fact that they managed to send 500 to support a division of alleged volunteers, it must be a lot. Because of the fact that the enemy had prepared to such an extent for this siege, Yakov was quite nervous, resorting to excessive drinking as he watched and waited for the first attack to begin. And it was at midnight, while everyone slept peacefully within the city walls, that the echo of artillery fire awoke the citizens of Tsaritsyn. 360 guns of various caliber rocked Tsaritsyn with their bombardment. and would continue to do so throughout the remainder of the night throughout various bombardments. By the time the sun rose in the east, a tenth of the city would lie in ruin. Chapter 70. God favors the best artillery. Sleep? That was for the weak, a concept that the population of Tsaritsyn became well accustomed to as the shells fell on top of their homes throughout the night. The spring offensive had begun, and the Red Army was caught with their pants down. They, after all, not expected the Iron Brigade to receive so many volunteers in such a short amount of time, to the extent that it was now known as the Iron Division. And to be fair, neither had Bruno. Regardless, barrages battered the city and its defenders throughout the night. Every thunder which echoed in the distance was a shot fired towards military targets, and not necessarily areas which civilians inhabited. Or such was Bruno's objective. Though he did not care if civilians were caught up in an attack targeting hostiles, the reality was deliberately targeting civilians was something Bruno was not fond of. It served no tactical or practical purpose, and any idiot who said that it would break the people's morale was an idiot. More often than not, such deliberate and indiscriminate attacks against unarmed civilians serve the opposite purpose. Because of this, Bruno made sure the calculations used by the artillery batteries were precise as they rained shells down upon the Bolsheviks who were in the trenches and fortifications they had built to defend the city. The Red Army was forced to endure the artillery fired throughout the night, with the battery only ceasing once the sun had risen with the dawn. It was then that the Red Army could gain some rest, retaliating as they fired off their own artillery back at those who would try to seize the city from them. Of course, this wasn't exactly as easy as Yakov Sverdlov thought it would be. After all, Bruno's artillery strikes didn't just serve the purpose of battering the enemy fortifications. Rather, they also acted as a method to conceal their real targets, which were the munitions and supply depots as well as in artillery pieces used by the Red Army within the city. For example, the Russian forces infiltrated the city in civilian garb throughout the night, under Bruno's orders, where they detonated explosives within the munition stockpiles and used thermite to disable the enemy guns, or at least a large portion of them. Because of this, the artillery fire which targeted the Iron Division and the Russian Division supporting their efforts were fewer than 20. Bruno had planned such sabotage operations months in advance. Thus, the men of the Iron Division had spent the last few weeks establishing an elaborate trench system around the city of Tsaritsyn. Thus, when the Red Army did finally manage to retaliate with barges of their own, the Iron Division and their Tsarist allies simply hid in more fortified positions of the trenches, allowing them to simply wait out the storm with limited casualties. This was a tactic Bruno learned from the Great War during his past life. Though trenches had been used in warfare throughout the centuries, they evolved into highly elaborate systems during the Great War. After all, soldiers spent months at a time in these very trenches before being rotated out. And because of this, they needed to provide many features for daily life in addition to protection from enemy artillery. Thus, the Iron Division's trenches were more than enough to protect them from the guns used by the Red Army. Meanwhile, every time the Red Army ceased their meager retaliation, the artillery beneath Bruno's command would restart their own barrage, sending thousands of shells onto the Red Army's fortifications per every minute of sustained fire. It was as if hell itself had descended upon the Red Army, as their soldiers were engulfed by fire and shrapnel throughout the day. Knowing that this was a siege, and would likely go on for months, Bruno opted to simply relax in the rear lines of the trenches. He was sipping on his coffee, while gazing through his binoculars towards the city of Tsaritsyn, and how it continued to endure the barrage. After which he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pocket watch, observing time as it passed. Ludwig stood by Bruno's side, surprised by how calm the man was, as the echo of guns continued throughout the day, never really coming to a period of silence as both sides engaged with one another. The man couldn't really understand why his younger brother was so calm and collected, nor why he was simply observing his pocket watch, especially as an artillery shell detonated within the vicinity, spraying shrapnel towards them, and in doing so, causing Ludwig to crouch down and cover his head. Upon seeing his older brother behave so cowardly, Bruno simply sighed heavily and shook his head as he put his coffee mug on the table next to him. There was a stern tone in Bruno's voice as he repeated the words he had said to the Russian general in St. Petersburg, almost as if he were the older brother, and Ludwig was the little sibling in need of a proper scolding. Relax, it's not the shell you hear that kills you. You better get comfortable. This is a siege, Ludwig. We will be here for some time. Luckily for us, I had some of the Russians sabotage the guns of the Red Army. Because of this, we will only sustain minor casualties when compared to the enemy. Ludwig was honestly surprised by the extent to which Bruno had prepared for this siege, even going so far as to sabotage the enemy in such an insidious way. He was quick to ask how Bruno had thought of this. I mean, I understand that the sabotage has certainly resulted in favorable conditions to our forces, but I'm just curious how you thought to take such measures in the first place. Bruno did not even look at his brother as he put down his binoculars and gazed upon the explosions in the distance with his naked eye. He instead picked up his coffee mug and took another sip before responding to the man with the same callous voice he had previously used when lecturing the man. A great man once said that God is on the side with the best artillery. In my experience, this is mostly a true statement. Though our guns outnumber those of the Red Army, they had months in advance to prepare for a proper siege, bringing along large-caliber guns for this purpose. Me? I was thinking long-term when I plotted this campaign, and because of that I brought 75mm guns, which are more mobile and easier to deploy in the field. After all, this war will not be fought with sieges alone. Because of this, we may outnumber the guns that the enemy had at the start of this siege, but they had much more powerful artillery. I merely even the odds, or should I say stack them heavily in our favor. After all, I doubt that an inexperienced propagandist and philosopher like that little rat would even think that we would attempt to sabotage their munitions and artillery in the middle of the night on the first day of our siege. Inexperienced commanders will be the death of the Red Army. This is what happens when you send farmers and machinists to fulfill the job of a soldier. All we have to do is sit here and wait. Sooner or later the enemy will fly the white flag, and if they don't, all that will remain of their pathetic little army would be corpses. Either way, we don't have to take unnecessary risks in pursuit of a quick victory, such as storming their trenches. The fact of the matter is, this siege was won the moment I made my preparations. Now all we have to do is wait patiently until the time comes to claim victory. You should enjoy yourself, Ludwig. This is, after all, your first and last campaign. You have the privilege of sitting back and enjoying the conflict as my personal adjutant. So enjoy it while it lasts, because you will never have such an experience again. After saying this, Bruno walked off. He appeared to be taking a stroll while artillery began to strike the Iron Division's trenches, almost as if it were nothing more than the spring rain. All the while, the more unexperienced soldiers serving beneath his command ran to more fortified sections of the trenches, seemingly unaware of the fact that they were out or range of the enemy's guns. Ludwig, who wasn't exactly all that well read in the life and times of Napoleon, had no idea who Bruno was quoting as a great man, but nevertheless the quote would stick with the man for the rest of his life. Even in the 21st century, when the United States had prioritized airstrikes over artillery, the war in Ukraine had proven that artillery still had a prominent place on the battlefield. With many American veterans from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan who foolishly volunteered to fight on behalf of the Ukrainians learning this lesson the hard way. Unfortunately, it was often a lesson that cost a man his life. Nevertheless, no matter how modern the battlefield became, artillery, even in primitive forms such as those employed in the Cold War, seemed to be an incredibly effective means of dispatching the enemy to their maker. And that was exactly what Bruno would prove here in Tsaritsyn, not that it really needed to be proved by this point in time. Chapter 71. Retaliation and Retribution. As anticipated, the French army quickly became concerned about the overwhelming amount of machine guns which the Germans appeared to be manufacturing. And as a result, they quickly began working on acquiring whatever variants of such weapons they could, while also working on developing a machine gun of their own that could effectively counter the Germans should they enter the war. Bruno had suspected this would be the case. But while the French had a problem, the 8mm Lebel cartridge which they made use of was difficult to feed in cloth or metallic belts. Due to the fact that it had been necked down from larger caliber rounds twice, it required a unique feeding system, meaning that acquiring Maxims, which were the most common form of machine gun in the world at the moment, was not a practical measure. After all, it would have to be chambered in a cartridge that was not standard to French infantry. This had its own problems. The French would either have to adopt the maxim and begin the domestic manufacture and procurement of another round to be used exclusively by its machine guns, which itself created logistical nightmares in the field, or it would have to adopt a new rifle with a different cartridge, either by domestic development and manufacture, or simply by licensed production from a friendly or non-hostile source. Again, this created a multitude of problems for logistics and procurement during a time of war. This meant that the Browning M1895 and the Maxim gun, which were already available on the international market, were not ideal to the French army. Luckily for the French, there was already a machine gun in development for the army. It was the Puteau's Model 1905 machine gun, and the makers of this weapon were under a lot of pressure by the French government to finish its design and begin production. There was, of course, one problem with this one that would heavily favor Bruno and the German army should the French actually mass-produce these machine guns for war. The Puteau's Model 1905 machine gun operated off of the legendary bang gas system. If one were to know a thing or two about the history of automatic and semi-automatic weapons, especially those which fired rifle-caliber projectiles, this would be a name they would immediately facepalm upon hearing. As previously mentioned, there was a common fear that drilling a hole in the barrel for the purpose of acting as a gas port would cause irregular erosion and would limit the service life of the weapon in question. Something Bruno knew from his past life was utter nonsense. However, this was a myth that persisted in firearms development well into WW2, where it was later proven to be horse crap. Because of this, the bang gas system was introduced. Its design was by nature complex and a nightmare to perform maintenance on. It was also notoriously unreliable in all firearms that made use of it. Originally developed in 1903, it would see use in two machine gun designs, both of which were French, and several rifle designs, including the Gür 41, which was the German Army's first and abysmal attempt at producing a semi-automatic rifle. For obvious reasons, it proved to be incredibly unreliable in the field, no doubt because it made use of the bang gas system. However, because the French were desperate to begin fielding machine guns in their army as a means of catching up with the enormous head start the Germans had, who were fielding one of the most reliable machine guns ever developed in human history, they opted to begin mass production of the Puteau's Model 1905 machine gun immediately upon its completion. This was something that Bruno had only marginally anticipated, but one that would work heavily in the German army's favor when the time for the Great War came. In 1907, during his past life, the French would adopt a variant of the machine gun that was slightly improved, but still such a piece of junk that the infamous Hotchkiss would eventually be developed to replace it. However, at the start of the war, the French had so few machine guns they still used the 1907 variant of the Puteau's in significant numbers. If the 1905 was mass-produced in this timeline, as a hasty means of solving an immediate problem, then this only favored the Germans, as one could expect every single machine gun used by the French army that was not a later Hotchkiss, assuming it was invented, to jam in the field repeatedly, thus giving the Germans an enormous advantage during the coming war, at least at the very start. And it was perhaps because they already understood the faults of this weapon platform that the French army leadership were currently meeting to discuss the need for a better machine gun. Among the French generals was the chief of staff, who was a man by the name of Jean Pendezec. Jean quickly expressed his fears regarding the 1905 Puteau's machine gun, with an air of snobbishness that only a Frenchman could conjure in such a circumstance. The Germans may have built hundreds, or perhaps even thousands of Maxims, but there is no need to fear. We will have a sufficient number of machine guns in 5 years' time to arm every battalion. Still, it would be best to develop a better solution to the problem. I mean, even during our trials, the Puteau's had proven to have some difficulties that would be less than ideal if not properly solved by the time the European war breaks out. So I expect either an improved design of the Puteau's or a superior replacement within 2 years' time. Do you understand what I am saying to you all right now? The generals beneath Jean's command naturally shared his concerns and were eager to remedy the solution. After all, the current gap between the French army and the German army appeared to be widening with each day that passed, especially since they had only now just begun manufacturing the Puteau's machine gun, while the Germans had sent 500 Maxim guns, or at least their locally produced variant, to Russia as a means of military aid. If such a thing was the case, Then did that not mean the Germans had thousands of such weapons currently serving in the army? The French did not know this, but in 2 years' time, which was what it would take for them to come out with an improved variant of the Putos, the German army would have already begun adopting and manufacturing the superior MG-34 to replace all the Maxim guns in active service, which would instead either be shipped to other nations as foreign aid or given over to the Army Reserve. Either way, whatever machine gun the French army fielded at the onset of the Great War, which the great powers were currently theorizing under the name of the European War, would be inferior to the German product. After a long, volatile, and largely fruitless conversation, Jean exited the building which housed the French High Command and entered the parking lot where he sat and unlocked the doors to his automobile. Or more specifically, the chauffeur tasked with driving him did. He sat in the back seat of the luxury vehicle and pulled out the day's newspaper, no doubt containing a headline regarding the war in Russia. Either way, he did not expect that the moment the engine was ignited that the car he was in would blow up, engulfing him in the explosion and killing him, and the military officer tasked with driving him around on the spot. The attack was swift, sudden, and entirely unexpected. The assassination of the French Army's chief of staff would be the headlines of the following day's papers. And though French intelligence would immediately investigate the incident, they would never find the true culprits. Rather, all evidence pointed to local socialist parties, no doubt planted by the agents of the German Foreign Intelligence Department, who were the real perpetrators behind the assassination. An act of vengeance and retaliation upon the shamelessness of the French who dared to assassinate Germany's rising star. Of course, the Kaiser would extend his greatest condolences to the French and use these measures to crack down upon political dissidents in the German Reich who shared sympathies. Whether you were a socialist, communist, or even a social democrat, the German Reich entered a state where it was favorable to oppress and harass anyone even remotely associated with Marxist ideals. Unknowingly, Bruno's goals of securing the traditional, conservative, and religious society of the German Reich had been advanced by the Kaiser in the name of vengeance on his behalf, something which, when he learned about, would bring a smile to the man's face. Chapter 72. The Arch-Nemesis Lurking in the Shadows. The death of the French Army's chief of staff had far-reaching consequences across all of Europe, but especially in France proper. Leon Sinclair was currently at a bar drinking excessively to cope with the most recent attack. According to the French government who had investigated the assassination, it was conducted by the French socialists. But that was utter bullshit and he knew it. Of course, Leon would be aware, an avid member of the French revolutionary socialist movement, that none of his comrades would make such an attack. That was just asking for trouble they were not yet prepared to deal with. So then who? Who could possibly pull off such an attack on French soil? Wasn't the answer obvious? It was the fucking Germans. It was always the Germans. The man was quite livid. He had just come home from putting down the rebellion in Madagascar to find the news of the Bolshevik Revolution. Everything from the death of Leon Trotsky in St. Petersburg, where he was shot like a dog in the streets and left as puppy chow for the hounds of the Tsarist loyalists, to the fact that the Red Army was being held responsible for the assassination attempt on Bruno's life, something which Leon was personally suspicious of, but had no evidence for his theories, which would broadly be considered conspiratorial by anyone who heard them. And then there was the existence of the Iron Division. It was simply abnormal. How did the Germans arm, supply, and train a force of so-called foreign volunteers in such a short span of time to fight against the Red Army? And why was he, of all people, in command of it? Truth be told, Leon had been keeping tabs on Bruno and his rise to power. Not necessarily since the Boxer Rebellion, where they first met, but most certainly since his exploits in Manchuria, where he was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun 4th Class for his efforts at Port Arthur. A prestigious award, no doubt. One worthy of a man who had won a significant battle on behalf of the Imperial Japanese Army. Bruno had been busy making a name for himself by participating in foreign conflicts, and in doing so, building ties for the German Reich to other imperial powers. That bastard had already risen to the rank of General Lieutenant, only to be discharged from the army, and immediately forming the Iron Division, a so-called force of volunteers to fight against the Red Menace? No, Leon wasn't buying it. There was no way this Iron Division was a force of volunteers, or at least not wholly so. At the very least, its leaders were active members of the German armed forces, acting under the guise of foreign volunteers to avoid causing an international dispute. Without a doubt, Bruno's discharge was a mere farce on behalf of the Kaiser and the general staff of the German army. Bruno was 100% acting under the orders of the German army, and would no doubt return to their ranks and active service once the war was over. No doubt accumulating many honors for his participation in the Bolshevik Revolution. It was a deeply cunning scheme, one that few men saw through. And perhaps it was simply because of Leon's hatred for the Germans that he could see through it. Some people said hatred made you blind to the truth, but in many cases it made you hyper-aware of conspiracies in the shadows. Conspiracies that, while true as could be, would make you mocked by those in polite company should you ever declare such a thing to be reality. And it was because of Leon's hatred for the Germans that he could see through the lies Bruno and the German high command had concocted in order to send the German army into Russia. A bold move, to be sure, and a controversial one should the world become aware of this conspiracy. Whether it was the fact that the German army was operating in Russia illegally under the guise of this so-called Iron Division, or the idea that the assassination of the French chief of staff was actually the wicked deed of the German Reich. Proving either of these theories was damn near impossible for Leon. He, after all, was only a colonel in the French army. He had neither fame, fortune, nor connections to bring these conspiracies to the light of the public. And because of this, he drank his sorrows away, dressed fully in his uniforms, with the medals he had been awarded for fighting in China and Africa pinned to his chest. Next to him was a haggard and grimy middle-aged man, wearing the clothes of a factory worker, which were covered in oil stains after his day at work. The two men were drinking the same brand of cognac while staring into their glasses, neither of which actually dared to speak to one another, at least not loud enough for others to hear who may be listening in. Rather, they whispered to each other just loud enough that they could understand each other's words. Comrade Sinclair, the collective has determined that we are not responsible for the death of the Chief of Staff. It would appear your theories of international players being at fault are indeed correct. At the very least, nobody in our movement was aware of this attack or its planning. However, we have no proof. And ultimately, it's the word of the government versus our own. The people in the streets are demanding the blood of everyone who has even read Marxist philosophy, let alone those who openly display their allegiance to the cause. Now is not the time to pursue the truth. Rather, we must keep our heads low. Especially you. You alone are the hope of gaining the support of the army for the day our revolution begins. So just lie low and condemn us if you have to. Hunt us, even if that needs to be done. But never reveal to anyone other than your comrades where your heart truly lies. That's all for now. I have to go. If I appear beside you any longer, it will only allow suspicion. Good luck, and may we meet again, even if it must be in the next life. Leon did not say a word. He simply sat there in silence, drinking his cognac until his comrade had paid for his drinks and left the pub. He was furious beyond belief. His eyes were clearly bloodshot, whether from excessive substance abuse, lack of sleep, or something else entirely only Leon knew. But he had rather subconsciously made Bruno out to be the ultimate evil in this world, his arch-nemesis who he would one day rise above and see defeated, on his knees begging for him and his family to live. After all, the man was everything Leon resented in this world. Bruno was a man of noble heritage, and in public a practicing Christian. He was a hardcore supporter of the German Conservative Party, which was a party that represented the wealthy landowning nobility in the German Reich, which was everything Leon hated. But on top of this, rumor had it that Bruno's family also had ties to the Berlin movement, which was a composition of political parties and political philosophies which represented the interests of the German Christian middle class. After all, Bruno's family was relatively recently established as a noble house, and in the previous century prior to becoming part of the Junker coalition were a middle-class family of professional soldiers. Because of this, they often extended helping hands to parties which were somewhat aligned with the German Conservative Party, but still representing their own interests, such as the Christian Social Party, which at one point formed a political coalition with the German Conservative Party having shared the ideals of anti-liberalism and pro-monarchism, but also added the priorities of Christian ethics, national identity, and anti-Semitism on top of them, all of which were also things that Leon despised. And though Bruno had yet to express any interest in politics thus far, nor had he ever shared his support of the Christian Social Party and its more radical ideas. At the end of the day, his family had hands in both the German Conservative Party and the Christian Social Party, as well as other far-right political parties. Making him, as far as Leon was concerned, was guilty by association. What was Bruno guilty of? Being opposed to Marxism, liberalism, and what would one day be referred to as progressivism, which for a literal communist sympathizer like Leon and an active member of the French socialist revolutionary movement, was about as grave as a sin as one could be guilty of. In other words, Bruno was rather normal for the time. But political extremists rarely functioned on logic or reason. And because of this, Leon made it his life's goal to be the end of Bruno and men like him. Bruno had no idea that he had suddenly found himself having an arch-nemesis who was plotting towards his destruction. And it would be many years before he even became aware of Leon's existence, having forgotten entirely about the snooty French man and their brief encounter in China years ago. Chapter 73. The Daily Life of Siege Warfare. This shall hence become my music. King Charles XII of Sweden. Such were the first words that resounded in Bruno's mind upon awaking to the echo of guns in the dawn. In a similar vein, the legendary Swedish king had spoken this exact quote upon hearing the thunder of his artillery crack the sky when fired upon his enemies for the first time. Bruno awoke after a long night of artillery, which ceased sometime around 2 a.m., only to be resumed with the break of dawn. For him, it was the sign that he needed to awaken and start the day. Truth be told, sieges were often long and dull affairs. What was Bruno's first action upon getting out of bed? The same as it would be if he were home, rather than in the trenches outside Tsaritsyn. First, he would get dressed, bathe, brush his teeth, before having breakfast. All the while artillery crackled in the background. He was, of course, not the only one undertaking such mundane actions of daily life. Nor was it just the privileged officer corps in the rear of the trenches. Rather, all soldiers began these activities who had awakened with the dawn, preparing for their shift for whatever role that had been given during this deployment. Machine gunners switched roles, as a new team began to man the guns, while others went to get some rest. And the same could be said for those whose function was to operate the artillery. Even the riflemen sat beneath the fortified trenches, which had been covered with sandbags. For the sake of not revealing future tactics, Bruno had not laid barbed wire across no man's land. Nor had he yet to invent landmines to be lain within the desolate region between his trenches and the city of Tsaritsyn. Would such things prove to be effective and decimate the enemy waves prior to their charge against his fortifications? Oh, most certainly. But it was also a trump card, which he prepared for his grand defensive strategy when the time came for the Great War to begin. After all, Bruno had little hope in Kaiser Wilhelm II being able to convince Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Franz Joseph I to be able to settle their differences in the Balkans and instead fight together against the British and the French. It was simply inevitable that Germany should enter a two-front war. And while he had the opportunity to ensure the Italians fulfilled their obligations of the Triple Alliance, or the Central Powers as it was now known, Bruno did not trust the Italians, whether it came to their competency in the field or their loyalty to the alliance. History had proven the Italian army was incapable of performing satisfactorily in both regards. They were more of a liability than they were a gain as far as Bruno was concerned. And because of this, he was already devising a strategy on how to eliminate the entire Italian army at Isonzo, and then march on Rome, forcing them to surrender at the start of their entry into the war. In fact, that was much of what Bruno did in his spare time, when he wasn't observing the ongoing shelling of Tsaritsyn, planning for the future, as well as writing his affections to his family, assuring them that he was safe, and that he would be home as soon as possible. Bruno wrote back home as frequently as he could, and because of this, his family felt a sense of closeness to him even if he was far, far away from home, with one letter in particular from his wife being kept on his person at all times. My dearest love, I miss you more than words can say. The days drag on without you, and I'm counting the seconds until you're back where you belong by my side. The children and I are holding things together, but it's not the same without you here. The thought of you out there, away from me, drives me mad. I need you home, safe, where I can keep you close, where you're mine and mine alone. Come back to me soon, my love. I'll be waiting. Forever yours, Heidi. This letter was especially heartwarming to Bruno in these troubled times because his children had all drawn rather crude smiley faces along with their own messages, which consisted of all the poor grammar he expected from children their age, all of which expressed the love they held for their father and their desire for him to come home soon. In addition to this, Bruno would keep correspondence with the Kaiser and the German High Command, informing them of the ongoing efforts of the siege and the Russian army, which was active in different parts of the country. While Tsaritsyn was a location of strategic significance and was made a priority as a result, it wasn't the only battlefield at the moment. But frankly speaking, Bruno didn't care how many soldiers of the Russian army and the Red Army died elsewhere, so long as the war continued to progress in the Tsar's favor. Instead, he was more concerned about the objective in front of him. With each day, tens of thousands of shells were dropped on Tsaritsyn, and thousands were fired back in response. But as 2 weeks passed, it became abundantly clear to both sides that one side had significantly more firepower, which was naturally a result of the sabotage operations Bruno had ordered to conduct on the first night. This sabotage only continued with each passing night since. By now, not only had the Red Army's field guns been reduced to a dozen in total, but their factories were undergoing repair and were incapable of producing more shells to field. Whatever stockpiles remained would be depleted in 3 days at the latest if the factories could not find themselves up and running in the meantime. Though the Red Army tried to hide its munitions, food, water, medical supplies, etc. in different locations every night, the saboteurs quickly spotted them and destroyed the stockpiles every time. And while Yakov had begun to suspect that someone in his ranks had turned traitor, the reality of the situation was that the people of Tsaritsyn, or at least a small portion of them, were loyalists, who fed information to the Tsarist soldiers outside the city's gates, who would, in turn, report them to Bruno. After confirming the information was accurate every time, Bruno would send his saboteurs to eliminate the stockpiles. Not entirely. After all, it would be no fun if the enemy ran out of supplies in the first 2 weeks of the siege. In fact, the more the stockpiles slowly dwindled, the more the situation became hopeless to the soldiers of the Red Army. After all, they knew by now that they had been betrayed, and that the enemy was simply screwing with them. Of course, the only other option was to surrender and be shot in the streets like Trotsky had been. Because of this, they fought on no matter how dire the situation became. This was despite the fact that the enemy could, at any point, infiltrate the city and destroy their supplies entirely. Hell, the Loyalists could probably cut the throats of the Red Army's leadership while they slept. But they didn't, not out of some sense of benevolence, but because the enemy found their misery entertaining. And finally, after 2 weeks of this game of cat and mouse, Yakov Sverdlov finally had enough, ordering his soldiers, whose morale was thoroughly shattered, to storm the enemy's fortifications. For 2 weeks they had been humiliated, while suffering mass casualties under the near-constant barrage of the German guns, which rotated to ensure that near all hours of the day shells were falling on the Red Army. They started off with 100,000 men defending the city. By now, roughly half had their lives taken from the shells which fell on their position, most of which were due to traumatic brain injuries caused by shrapnel. After all, unlike the soldiers of the Iron Division, the Red Army did not have steel helmets to protect their skulls from the German artillery, nor were their trenches designed with such complex fortifications such as areas to protect them from artillery. Because of this, they were simply forced to sit and hope that the enemy artillery did not take their life. This was Bruno's overall goal, as he stood at the front lines of the trenches, gazing through the fog while smoking a cigarette. He could tell by the unusual density of the fog that today, after 2 weeks of constant shelling, sabotage, and harassment, the enemy would soon make their move. It was only a matter of time before the counterattack would begin. And because of this, Bruno watched and waited, while silently making preparations in the background for what would occur only moments from now. After all, the thick fog which permeated the landscape gave an excellent opportunity to the Red Army, one which Bruno knew their inexperienced commander would take. Chapter 74. The most lethal weapon of all. After 2 weeks of non-stop harassment via the use of constant shelling, sabotage, and just general humiliation, Bruno estimated that the inexperienced commander would have broken by now. and would no doubt be ordering a suicidal charge to eliminate the enemy before they could continue their assault. Meanwhile, Bruno stood at the front lines, alert and ready, while his older brother Ludwig stood by his side. The man had dark circles around his eyes, clearly having not received a good night's sleep since the siege began. No doubt kept awake by the ceaseless thunder of guns in the background. Bruno gazed upon his older brother and the poor state he was in, making a comment as he did so, while gazing off into the fog which permeated in the distance, preventing him from seeing what was happening beyond its boundaries. You better drink some coffee or snort some cocaine, because any minute now, the enemy will begin making their advance. The fog is the perfect cover for them to assault our trenches, and they won't have another opportunity to do so. Ludwig looked at his brother as if he was some kind of inhuman monster. The man was as energetic and as spry as a man could possibly be. Was cocaine really the answer to this? This was naturally not the case. Bruno was simply accustomed to war at this point. But cocaine was indeed a stimulant that was issued by not only the German army, but all other major militaries across the world to keep their soldiers energetic and awake while at war. A practice that would only fall out of favor after the Great War ended due to the side effects that became immediately apparent because of the overwhelming number of soldiers who were issued the substance in their ration kits. Ludwig quickly did as Bruno suggested, and sure enough the Red Army had begun its assault not long after. While Ludwig was waking himself up by adding cocaine to his coffee, Bruno had ordered a random machine gunner to fire a burst into the fog. In doing so, a scream could be heard. No doubt a soldier of the Red Army had been struck by the burst of fire. Because of this, Bruno blew his whistle, signaling his troops to drop what they were doing and to prepare the counter for the enemy charge. Thousands of men rushed to the edge of the trenches, with their rifles resting on the sandbags as they began to open fire into the fog. Meanwhile, Bruno pulled his Luger out of his holster and chambered a round by pulling on its toggle lock action. Once he had done this, he patted his brother Ludwig on the steel dome which the man wore on the top of his head and smirked at him. "Is this the excitement you were looking for?" Ludwig was terrified as he saw thousands of Red Army soldiers pouring through the fog with their bayonets attached. All the while they were cut like ribbons by the machine guns and rifle fire that tore through their ranks without mercy. He had never seen something so gruesome in his life before. He was, after all, a soldier who had spent his entire military career in a time of peace. But this was war, an actual war. Though he wasn't cognitively aware of it at this time. When he made it out of Russia, Ludwig would have a far better understanding of what Bruno had been through all these years. Meanwhile, Bruno no longer paid attention to his older brother and instead aimed down the sights of his Luger. Not with one hand, as was common in the era, but with two as was proper doctrine according to modern combat from the 21st century. The control he had over the weapon was more significant as he fired a single shot down range, piercing directly through the skull of a Red Army soldier who foolishly charged at Bruno with his bayonet drawn, as if with one thrust of his weapon he would end the revolution there on the spot. The man fell directly in front of Bruno, no more than 3 feet away as his lifeless eyes and open mouth stared at the man who killed him. Bruno, of course, did not give the man a second thought as he aimed his sidearm towards more oncoming men, shooting each and every one of them with absolute precision as they fell down along with those killed by the Iron Division's riflemen and machine gunners. Perhaps if the 50,000 or so Red Army soldiers had advanced from their own fortifications without the cover of fog to conceal them, then they all would have perished before reaching the Russo-German trench line. However, they managed to advance a significant degree with the fog concealing their assault. Because of this, thousands poured into the trenches to combat the Iron Division and Russian army in close quarters. Something Bruno was all too prepared for as he reached towards his belt. Not for a bayonet to stab the enemy with, but rather interestingly enough for his entrenching tool, which he pulled from its sheath and wielded as an axe against the intruders into his trench. Ludwig was freaking out as he used his rifle to prevent a Red Army soldier from skewering him with his bayonet. The man didn't even see his little brother come up from behind his assailant until Bruno had coldly and mercilessly split the man's skull over with his sharpened spade. Having just seen a man killed before his very eyes with a fucking shovel, Ludwig stared at Bruno in disbelief, who merely winked at his older brother before walking off, where he continued to get up behind the Red Army and split their skulls open with his shovel as if it were a weapon of mass destruction. As everyone tried to use their full-length rifles and the short sword-length bayonets on the end of them to kill each other in the confined spaces of the trench, Bruno simply walked among them like death incarnate, nimbly dodging the enemy's rather awkward thrusts and cracking their domes with his shovel, a weapon which was sturdy and sharp enough to cut through their skull and the brain beneath with a single hit. Perhaps if these men had been wearing a steel helmet, the blow would have been less severe. But the cloth hats on their heads, which bore the red star of the Bolshevik Revolution, did very little to prevent such a lethal strike from killing them. One by one, Bruno took the lives of the Red Army soldiers in the trench line, wielding a sharpened entrenching tool in one hand and a Luger in the other, only stopping to swap out the spent magazine of his sidearm before shooting men in the chest and cracking their domes open as if they were piñatas. Bruno's ability to navigate the trench was almost uncanny to the eyes of those who witnessed it. He saved many lives of his own soldiers and those of the Russians as he marched along the front lines, either putting bullets in the backs of the Red Army soldiers who were attacking his own, or outright smacking them in the skull with his entrenching tool, and in doing so killing them on the spot. Rarely would he need to give a man a second strike. The E-tool was after all lethal to those without a certain degree of protection on their heads. Because of this, Bruno's soldiers ended up thanking him as he saved them from potentially being stabbed by an enemy's bayonet. But by the time they managed to recover from their near-death experience, he had already moved on, ending the lives of any communist he came across without mercy and without remorse. As the slaughter continued, it became abundantly clear to the Red Army, who had lost thousands, if not tens of thousands, from the artillery fire and the machine guns spread as they marched through no man's land, that this was a battle they would not be winning. Because of this, the violence lasted for no more than 10 minutes at the most before the Red Army called off their assault and began fleeing back to their own fortifications with their tails between their legs. Naturally, Bruno would not allow the enemy to flee from his domain without suffering the consequences, and because of this he gave the order to all his men to open fire on those survivors who ran away from the Russo-German trench line. In the end, after failing to succeed in their assault, the Red Army fled from the Russo-German trenches, only to be mercilessly gunned down from behind. Out of the 50,000 men who attempted the suicidal charge, less than half returned safely to their fortifications at Tsaritsyn. Meanwhile, the Russo-German losses were less than a tenth of those suffered by the Red Army. At the same time, these same men discovered that the entrenching tool was perhaps the most lethal weapon on the modern battlefield. Chapter 75. The Red Scourge. Yakov Sverdlov could hardly believe what he had witnessed after his soldiers returned to him battered and bloody from their failed assault against the Russo-German fortifications outside the city of Tsaritsyn. His plan to use the fog as cover to conceal his advance so that his troops would have a fighting chance against the enemy artillery and machine guns had been seen through. Only after advancing a mere 100 meters had the enemy began to open fire upon the Red Army. Though they made it to the Russo-German trench line and valiantly fought in close-quarters combat, it was his men who suffered most previously, with more than half of what remained of his army being either wounded or killed in action during the attempted assault. Meanwhile, the Russo-German army suffered at most 1/10 of the casualties which the Red Army had sustained, if even that. It was becoming clear that there was no hope of victory here in Tsaritsyn. The enemy had encircled them and blockaded the city. In doing so, they prevented supplies and reinforcements from entering Tsaritsyn. Meanwhile, the artillery barrage had begun again after the Red Army's assault had concluded, with even now shells falling nearby and shrapnel flying through the air. Yakov didn't realize it, but his forehead was bleeding after a piece of shrapnel had grazed him. He did not realize this until a medic ran up to him and immediately began to treat his wound. He was in shock after having witnessed his army cut to pieces by the enemy. How was this even a war? St. Petersburg had been a complete and total disaster for the Red Army, who laid siege to it. The moment the Germans entered the fray and brought with them machine guns, it was almost like a cheat code had been unlocked. The former leader and founder of the Red Army, along with 80,000 of his men, lie dead at St. Petersburg, with Trotsky being shot in the streets like a stray dog. Meanwhile, his corpse was left to be torn apart by the hounds of the Black Hundreds militias. At first, Yakov had thought that the overwhelming numbers of his troops here at Tsaritsyn would allow him to easily repel the enemy. But as far back as the first day of the siege, everything had gone horribly wrong for him, and continued to do so. Not only were the majority of his siege guns destroyed, but his supplies kept dwindling due to repeated sabotage, which occurred every night. By the time he was finally able to gain favorable conditions for a siege, half of his army was already dead, or so grievously wounded they were incapable of performing the operation. Because of this, he charged an enemy army that was equal in number and superior in terms of firepower, resulting in a devastating result. It was a surprise that he was left with roughly half of his forces. But then again, they were repelled by the Russo-German army within trenches after only 5 to 10 minutes. It was a humiliating defeat, and now his only option was to either sit here in Tsaritsyn and be starved to death, launch another assault which would result in a similar disaster, or surrender and be executed on the spot by the German commander, who did not even consider Marxists as being human, and were thus unworthy of any rights which society afforded even the most heinous criminals. There had been no signs of the collaborators within the city walls, or even their identities. And because of this, Yakov could not even vent his frustrations on those who had betrayed him. It was while the man was biting his own nails in anxiety that he heard a dreadful sound. A whistle blew in the distance, as 25,000 German soldiers shouted in unison the official motto of the Imperial German Army, "God with us," having been shouted by 25,000 men at the top of their lungs. It was a thunderous echo, as if the heavens themselves were singing it in the background. And the most terrifying part of all, it was being shouted by men hiding in the thick fog that had concealed the Red Army's charge. Yakov knew what was happening. After their losses, the Russo-German army had begun a countercharge, heralded by the artillery barrage that had just now struck the Red Army after fleeing back to their fortifications just now. Roughly 47,500 men would be charging at the city of Tsaritsyn from all sides. It was a complete and total encirclement, one which the Red Army could not defend against. And sure enough, gunfire quickly echoed in the distance, as the Bolsheviks exchanged shots with the enemy, who began assaulting them. Yakov could see a flood of black and green uniforms as they came rushing forward with rifles in hand, disregarding their own lives in pursuit of glory. It was clearly the end for him, no matter how he looked at it. The battle ended as swiftly as it began. After obliterating over 25,000 men during the Red Army's failed assault, Bruno's remaining forces, which outnumbered the enemy 2-1, quickly encircled them and slaughtered them. For every loss the Iron Division and the accompanying Tsarist forces sustained, it only fueled the survivors with even more fervor as they ran the Red Army through with their bayonets and shot them in the streets when the cowardly Bolsheviks threw their weapons aside and got on their knees to plead for mercy. But as the good book said, "Thou shalt not suffer a Marxist to live," or it would have had Marxism been a thing when the Bible was written. Instead, the closest interpretation was, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," which, as far as Bruno was concerned, extended to Marxists by very nature of their similar anti-human beliefs. Because of this philosophy, Bruno ordered every man who took up arms in the name of the Bolshevik Revolution to be lined up and shot by firing squads in public. Actions undertaken of the Iron Division with the thousands of prisoners they had gained. All the while Bruno walked through the streets as his orders were being carried out and nodded his head in approval. Meanwhile, he gave the command to have the workers who had volunteered to perform labor for the Red Army in the city's factories to be thoroughly reprimanded for their treasonous acts. But not willing to become a villain in the eyes of the Russian people, or the working class in general, Bruno gathered them all before him and his men, whose intimidating presence only added further to the fear which these civilians felt. It was there he gave a speech to them all, one which by the end of would gain favor for him. "I don't know what drove all of you to collaborate with those who would deny you your faith, your identity, and your motherland. And frankly, I don't really care. As far as I'm concerned, any man who waves the red banner is the same as a rabid dog, deserving of the same punishment. But the Lord is merciful, even to those who blaspheme against him, as you all have done so. It is because of this I have decided to show leniency to those whose crimes consist of merely supporting these godless heathens, rather than directly spilling blood in their wicked ideology." Because of this, I will spare you all, under the condition that you all reject the Marxist principles which you have been following and condemn the leaders of this Bolshevik revolution as the anti-human monsters that they are. For those of you who refuse to acknowledge your sins and continue to rebel against your rightful monarch, as chosen by God to lead Russia and its people, your fate will be the same as the Red Army which lies slain here today. Choose wisely. I assure you, your families would prefer that you repent here today while I am still giving you the chance. Frankly, Bruno had not become a religious fanatic, even after coming to some understanding with God that he had rejected in the past. But the Tsar had depicted him in such a light, and he would not deny this image that the Russian people and the Red Army had of him in their own minds, especially when it was an effective means of controlling the masses. Victory on this day was not Bruno's, but rather God's, as the good Lord had cleansed this city of the Marxist heathens who had dared to taint its virtue. Bruno had been merely the instrument of God's will, a part he was more than willing to play, or so Russian propaganda would claim. Realistically speaking, the mercy which Bruno had shown these workers was merely practical in nature. If he went around killing every civilian who had helped the Bolsheviks, he would need to kill millions of people. And what would be the point of that? Especially when one considered that showing them mercy in the name of God was a better way to convince the Russian people that neither he nor the Tsar were the bad guys in this situation. It was, after all, the Marxists who had taken up arms against their rightful monarch who caused this war to begin. Luckily for Bruno, nobody dared reject his mercy. Instead, all the workers who had supported the Bolsheviks fell to their knees and rejected the ideals of Karl Marx and the evil they purported, all while praying to the Lord God Almighty, thanking him for his mercy and the mercy of the Tsar. These laborers who had begun to repent for their sins would do so first by condemning the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution and pointing out exactly who among them held senior positions in the Bolshevik Party. These senior communists were dragged out of the group of laborers they were hiding in. Among them was none other than Yakov Sverdlov, who after seeing his army so swiftly defeated stripped himself of any symbols or clothing that would openly display his allegiance. The socialist ideals he had fanatically believed in and spent his life pursuing violent revolution for suddenly became a symbol of shame when faced with the consequences of his actions. Luckily for Bruno, not only had he known who Yakov Sverdlov really was the entire time, but the people of Tsaritsyn so viciously threw him to the wolves when an opportunity to save themselves came. Bruno walked in front of the men identified as senior party members of the Bolshevik Revolution, stopping in front of Yakov Sverdlov. There was a cruel and sinister smirk on his face as he leaned down in front of the young Bolshevik leader and said the words that would condemn the man to his fate. "I know you. You're Yakov Sverdlov, aren't you?" "Yes, of course you are. I wouldn't mistake your distinctive features for anyone else in this world. Has it been fun? Playing the part of a revolutionary, I mean? Well, do you see the consequences of your actions now?" After taunting his prisoner like this, Bruno whistled, before giving his orders to the members of the Iron Division who surrounded the group of laborers up until this point. The workers who have begun their penance are to be freed at once. As for the senior members of the Bolshevik Party who they so generously have pointed out to us, they are to be executed with the rest of the Red Army. All but one, that is. Yakov Sverdlov here will be thoroughly interrogated before he meets his end. Do whatever is necessary to make him sing, you understand? As for what you do with his corpse, I really don't care. Just make an example of him, all right? The Iron Division saluted their general before fulfilling Bruno's orders. The workers would be incredibly thankful for the mercy they had been given, while the senior members of the Bolshevik Party would be lined up alongside their troops and shot in the streets, buried in a mass grave outside Tsaritsyn. As for Yakov Sverdlov, he would be brutally tortured until every bit of information that could be gained on the Bolshevik Party, its membership, its supporters, and the Red Army could beg gained. After being put out of his misery, his flayed body would be hung in the streets of Tsaritsyn as a reminder of the price that would be paid by every Marxist revolutionary leader in this life, wherever Bruno would find them, thus giving Bruno the nickname of the Red Scourge, for which Marxists around the globe of all denominations would know him by.